Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we are confronting a new realm of fear with 8 of the most disturbing true home alone horror stories ever documented. These accounts are not urban legends or recycled narratives. They are painstakingly compiled from genuine reports and first-hand submissions, retold with utmost respect for the harrowing experiences behind them. Each tale unfurls a unique nightmare, from uninvited stalkers to silent intruders hidden in the walls, reminding us that the terror of isolation sometimes arises from real and lurking threats. While some names and identifying details have been modified to safeguard those who survived these ordeals, the authenticity and gravity of what transpired remains completely intact. If you value real horror from the dark corners of true life, you are in the right place. Be sure to subscribe to Buried Files for more in-depth accounts that will haunt your nights, and activate notifications so you never miss when the unknown comes knocking. My name is Marcus Johnson, and what I am about to share happened during my junior year at Arizona State University. I had been living in a rental house near campus with 2 roommates, but when winter break arrived in December, they both went home to their families while I stayed behind to work at a local restaurant. The extra shifts meant good money, and honestly, I welcomed the quiet after months of constant noise and chaos. The house was a typical college rental, a 2-story place built in the 1970s with a finished basement that we used as a hangout space. It had wood paneling, old carpet, and a separate entrance that led directly outside through metal storm doors. We rarely locked those basement doors since we figured nobody would want to steal our beat-up furniture and gaming consoles. For the first few days alone, everything felt normal. I would wake up, grab breakfast, head to work, and return home to an empty house. The silence was actually refreshing. But by the end of the first week, I started noticing small things that did not quite make sense. My milk carton, which had been nearly full when I left for my shift, was almost empty when I returned home. I blamed it on my poor memory. Maybe I had been drinking more than I realized. Then my leftover pizza disappeared from the refrigerator. Again, I convinced myself that I must have eaten it late one night and forgotten. The missing food bothered me, but I tried to rationalize it away. College life had trained me to assume that everything had a logical explanation, even when it did not feel right. I started writing down what food I had before leaving for work just to keep track. Sure enough, items kept vanishing. A half loaf of bread gone, an entire container of deli turkey missing, crackers disappearing from the pantry. The pattern was consistent. Someone was taking just enough to eat, but not so much that it would be immediately obvious. Whoever was doing this knew how to avoid detection. I began to suspect that one of my roommates had returned early and was playing some kind of elaborate prank. I searched their rooms looking for signs that they had come back without telling me, but everything remained exactly as they had left it. Their beds were still unmade, their belongings undisturbed. That was when I started paying attention to other details around the house. The basement television had been left on one morning when I was certain I had turned it off the night before. The couch cushions were arranged differently than how I remembered them. Small changes that could easily be dismissed as forgetfulness, but the accumulation was becoming impossible to ignore. I decided to test my theory. Before leaving for work one Thursday morning, I carefully arranged items in the basement in specific ways. A magazine placed at an exact angle on the coffee table, couch pillows positioned precisely, the television remote set in an unusual spot. When I returned that evening, everything had been moved. The magazine was on the floor, the pillows were bunched up as if someone had been sleeping on them. The remote was on the opposite side of the room. Someone had definitely been in my house while I was gone, and they were making themselves comfortable in the basement. My first instinct was to call the police, but I hesitated. What would I tell them? That my food was disappearing and my furniture was moving? They would think I was paranoid or making things up. I needed more concrete proof before involving authorities. Instead, I decided to set up my own surveillance system. I positioned my laptop in the basement with its camera facing the main living area and set it to record while I was at work. The battery would not last all day, but it might capture something useful. The next evening, I rushed home and immediately checked the recording. For the first 2 hours, nothing happened. The basement remained empty and still. But then, at the 3-hour mark, I watched in absolute horror as the basement door opened and a man emerged from behind the water heater. He was middle-aged, wearing dirty clothes that looked like they had not been changed in weeks. His hair was greasy and unkempt, and he moved through the basement with the confidence of someone who knew the layout intimately. He walked to the couch, sat down, and turned on the television as if he owned the place. I watched in stunned silence as this stranger ate my food, used my bathroom, and made himself completely at home. He had clearly been living in my basement for an unknown amount of time, hiding behind the water heater during the day and emerging when I was gone. The water heater area was in a dark corner that we never accessed, hidden behind some old boxes and holiday decorations. The recording showed him staying active for several hours before disappearing back behind the water heater. He knew my schedule. He knew exactly when I left for work and when I would return. This had been going on for who knows how long, and I had been completely oblivious. My hands shook as I called 911. The dispatcher seemed skeptical at first, but when I explained that I had video evidence of someone living in my basement without permission, she took me seriously. Police arrived within 20 minutes, and I showed them the recording. 4 officers searched the house while I waited outside. They found his makeshift living space behind the water heater, a sleeping bag, bottles of water, and containers for human waste. He had created a small but functional living area in the darkest corner of the basement, complete with stolen food items and personal belongings that I had assumed were lost or misplaced over the months. The man was not there when they searched, but they found evidence that he had been coming and going through the basement storm doors, which had a broken lock that we had never bothered to fix. He had probably been watching the house for weeks before moving in, learning our routines and finding the perfect hiding spot. Officers told me that this was more common than people realized. Empty or partially occupied homes near college campuses were frequent targets for transients looking for temporary shelter. They often chose basements, attics, or other rarely used spaces where they could hide during the day and move around when residents were gone. The police set up surveillance and caught him 2 days later when he returned to collect his belongings. He had been living in my basement for over 6 weeks, surviving on stolen food and using our utilities. During questioning, he admitted that he had been in the house even when my roommates were there. But it was much easier to move around freely when I was alone. What disturbed me most was learning that he had been watching me sleep. He knew my schedule so well because he had been observing me for weeks, noting when I went to bed, when I woke up, and when I left for work. He had complete access to the house and had been moving through it silently while I was unconscious upstairs. The man was arrested for breaking and entering, burglary, and criminal trespass. He had a history of similar incidents and had been homeless for several years. The police explained that he probably chose our house because it looked like a typical college rental. Easy access, minimal security, and residents who were often away. I could not sleep in that house for weeks afterward. Every sound made me wonder if someone else was hiding somewhere, waiting for me to leave or fall asleep. We installed new locks, security cameras, and motion sensors throughout the house. I checked behind that water heater obsessively, even though I knew it was empty. My roommates returned from break to find the house transformed into a fortress. When I explained what had happened, they were horrified but also fascinated. They wanted to see the video and hear every detail about how someone had been living with us without our knowledge. The story spread quickly through our friend group and became legendary on campus, but for me it was not an interesting story to share at parties. It was a fundamental violation of safety and security that changed how I viewed private spaces forever. The idea that someone can secretly share your home, watch your routines, and live off your resources without detection is terrifying in a way that few people truly understand unless they have experienced it. Even now, years later, I still check behind water heaters and in dark corners whenever I move to a new place. I secure every possible entry point and remain hyper-vigilant about unexplained changes in my environment. That experience taught me that home invasion does not always involve broken windows or kicked-in doors. Sometimes the most dangerous intruders are the ones you never know are there. The basement tenant had been my unwelcome roommate for over a month, and if I had not started paying attention to the small details, he might have continued living there indefinitely. That realization still gives me chills, knowing that someone was sharing my space, breathing the same air, and watching my life unfold from the shadows. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and I am a single mother living in Tampa, Florida. What happened to me 3 months ago still makes me question everything I thought I knew about safety and technology. It was a Tuesday night in June when Hurricane Debbie was approaching the coast, bringing with it the kind of electrical storms that turn the sky into a war zone. My daughter Sophia was only 8 months old at the time, and like most new mothers, I had become obsessed with monitoring her sleep. I had installed one of those high-tech baby monitors with video and audio capabilities, the kind that connects to your phone and promises to give you peace of mind. The base unit sat on Sophia's dresser, and I kept the handheld receiver with me wherever I went in the house. That particular evening, the storm had knocked out power to half the neighborhood, but our house still had electricity. The wind was howling outside and rain pelted against the windows with such force that I worried the glass might crack. Sophia had been fussy all day because of the atmospheric pressure, but she had finally fallen asleep around 8 o'clock. I was in the kitchen washing dishes when the baby monitor started acting strangely. Instead of the usual soft static or gentle breathing sounds from Sophia's room, I began hearing what sounded like fragments of conversation. At first, I assumed it was interference from other electronic devices in the neighborhood, something that occasionally happened during storms. The voices were faint and distorted, cutting in and out with the static. I could not make out specific words, but there seemed to be at least 2 people talking back and forth. I walked closer to Sophia's room to check if the sounds were actually coming from there, but when I peeked inside, she was sleeping peacefully. The voices were definitely coming through the monitor, not from the room itself. I tried adjusting the frequency settings, thinking maybe the device was picking up radio transmissions or signals from another baby monitor in the area. But as I fiddled with the controls, the voices became clearer, and what I heard made my blood run cold. A man's voice said, "She put the baby down about 20 minutes ago." Then a second voice, also male, replied, "Good. Give it another hour before we make our move." I stood frozen in my kitchen, gripping the monitor so tightly that my knuckles turned white. These were not random radio signals or crossed wires from another family's baby monitor. These people were talking about me and Sophia, and they seemed to know our schedule with frightening accuracy. The conversation continued sporadically over the next few minutes, always with the same 2 voices discussing details about our house and routine. They mentioned that I usually went to bed around 10:30 and that I always checked on Sophia one last time before turning off the lights. They knew which rooms had windows facing the street and which ones were hidden from view. My first instinct was to call 911, but I hesitated because I knew how crazy it would sound. What would I tell them? That my baby monitor was picking up voices of people planning to break into my house? They would probably assume I was having some kind of postpartum anxiety episode or that the storm was making me paranoid. Instead, I decided to investigate further. I grabbed my phone and started recording the audio from the baby monitor, hoping to capture evidence of what I was hearing. The voices came and went with the static, but I managed to record several minutes of clear conversation. "The back door looks like the easiest entry point," one voice said. "No deadbolt, just a regular handle lock." "What about the dog?" the second voice asked. "There is no dog. I've been watching for 3 days. Just her and the baby." My legs nearly gave out when I heard that. Someone had been watching my house for 3 days, studying our routines and planning some kind of break-in. The detail about the back door was particularly terrifying because it was accurate. I had been meaning to install a deadbolt but had not gotten around to it yet. I crept through the house, turning off all the lights and checking every window and door to make sure they were locked. My hands shook as I drew all the curtains and blinds, suddenly aware of how exposed I had been living. If someone had been watching us for 3 days, they had seen everything. When I fed Sophia, when I did laundry, when I took showers. The storm outside was getting worse, with thunder that seemed to shake the entire house. Each flash of lightning illuminated the yard for a split second, and I found myself scanning for signs of movement or unusual shadows. But the real terror was coming through that baby monitor, which continued to broadcast fragments of conversation throughout the evening. Around 9:30, I heard one of the voices say, "Lights are going out in the front rooms. She is getting ready for bed." I had indeed been turning off lights as I made my final rounds through the house, following my usual bedtime routine without realizing I was being observed. The fact that they could see into my house and coordinate their observations through some kind of radio communication was beyond frightening. I called my sister Maria, who lived about 15 minutes away, and asked her to come over. I could not explain everything over the phone without sounding completely insane, but I told her I was scared and needed someone to stay the night. She could hear the panic in my voice and agreed to drive over despite the storm. While waiting for Maria to arrive, I continued monitoring the radio transmissions. The voices discussed timing, entry methods, and what they were looking for once they got inside. They mentioned jewelry, electronics, and cash, making it clear that this was a planned burglary. But they also talked about making sure we did not wake up during the process, which implied they knew we would be home. "If she wakes up, we just tie her up until we are finished," one voice said casually. "The baby will not be a problem." That was the moment I realized these people were not just planning to rob my house. They were prepared to use violence if necessary. The casual way they discussed restraining me and dismissing Sophia as not a problem suggested they had done this before and knew how to handle complications. Maria arrived around 10:15, soaked from the rain and confused about why I had sounded so panicked on the phone. I showed her the baby monitor and played back some of the recordings I had captured on my phone. At first, she was skeptical, suggesting it might be interference from emergency services or utility workers dealing with storm damage. But as we listened together, more transmissions came through with specific details about our house and movements. The voices discussed which car was mine in the driveway, mentioned that a light was still on in the kitchen, and noted that a second person had arrived. "There is another car now," one voice observed. "Looks like she has company." "Should we wait?" the second voice asked. "No, stick to the plan. 2 women and a baby, we can handle it." Maria's face went white when she heard that. She immediately called 911 while I continued recording the transmissions. The police dispatcher took the call seriously, especially when Maria explained that we had audio recordings of people planning to break into the house that night. 2 patrol cars arrived within 10 minutes. and I played the recordings for the officers. They were initially puzzled by the baby monitor situation, but became very concerned when they heard the specific details about our house and the casual discussion of violence. The officers conducted a thorough search of the property and surrounding area. Behind the trees at the back of my yard, they found two men in a pickup truck with radio equipment and binoculars. The men had been using short-range radios to communicate while conducting surveillance, and somehow their frequency had been picked up by my baby monitor's receiver. Both men were arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit burglary, stalking, and possession of burglary tools. Their truck contained rope, duct tape, crowbars, and detailed notes about my daily routine. They had been watching the house for over a week, not 3 days, as they had mentioned on the radio. During questioning, police learned that this was part of a larger operation targeting single mothers in the area. The men would identify houses with young children, conduct surveillance to learn routines, and then break in when they believed the occupants would be asleep. They specifically chose homes where they thought resistance would be minimal. The baby monitor had saved our lives by accidentally intercepting their radio communications. If I had not heard those transmissions, they would have broken in around midnight and found us completely unprepared. The police said it was extremely unusual for baby monitors to pick up two-way radio signals, but the storm conditions and their proximity to the house had created perfect circumstances for the interference. After that night, I could not sleep peacefully for months. Every sound from the baby monitor made me jump, wondering if I was hearing normal household noises or something more sinister. I installed a complete security system with cameras, motion sensors, and professional monitoring. I moved Sophia's crib into my bedroom and kept it there for weeks. The most disturbing part was realizing how vulnerable we had been without knowing it. These men had been watching us, learning our habits, and planning violence while I went about my normal routine completely unaware. The baby monitor that was supposed to help me protect Sophia had accidentally revealed how much danger we were really in. I still use baby monitors, but I have learned to pay attention to unusual sounds or interference. Technology can be both a shield and a window, protecting us from some dangers while accidentally revealing others. That storm brought more than just wind and rain. It brought the terrifying knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones watching from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The case went to trial 6 months later, and both men received significant prison sentences. But knowing they are locked up does not erase the memory of hearing strangers discuss breaking into my home and threatening my child. Some violations of safety and privacy leave permanent scars, changing how you view the world and your place in it forever. My name is Tyler Washington, and I work as a night security guard for a large office complex in Detroit, Michigan. Due to the pandemic, my company had transitioned to remote monitoring, which meant I could do most of my job from home using multiple computer screens and camera feeds. It was actually perfect for me. I could work nights while taking care of my elderly grandmother during the day, and the pay was decent enough to support both of us. Our house is a small 2-story place in a quiet neighborhood where most residents are elderly or working families. I had converted the basement into my home office, setting up multiple monitors to watch security feeds from various buildings downtown. The setup was impressive. 6 large screens showing different angles of lobbies, parking garages, and office floors that I monitored from midnight until 8 in the morning. My routine was consistent and methodical. I would start my shift at midnight, make coffee, and settle into my chair for 8 hours of surveillance. Every hour I would do a virtual patrol, checking each camera feed systematically and documenting anything unusual. Around 3 in the morning, I would take a 15-minute break to stretch my legs and grab a snack from the kitchen. At 6, I would make another cup of coffee to get through the final stretch. This routine had been working perfectly for almost a year when something started to feel wrong. It began 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday night when I heard footsteps upstairs during my shift. At first, I assumed it was my grandmother getting up to use the bathroom, which happened occasionally despite her usually sleeping soundly through the night. But when I checked on her a few minutes later, she was fast asleep in her bed. The next night, I heard the same pattern of footsteps around the same time. Slow, deliberate walking from the kitchen to the living room, then back to the kitchen. Again, I found my grandmother sleeping peacefully when I investigated. I started to wonder if the house was settling or if I was hearing sounds from neighboring houses, but the footsteps were distinctly coming from directly above my basement office. By the end of that first week, the footsteps had become a nightly occurrence. They always happened around 2:30 in the morning, always followed the same path through the kitchen and living room, and always lasted about 5 minutes. But my grandmother was always asleep when I checked, and she never mentioned being up during the night. What made it truly disturbing was how closely the footsteps matched my own routine. I realized that the timing coincided exactly with when I would normally take my break and walk through the kitchen to get a snack. Someone upstairs was mimicking my movements, following the same path I took every night, but they were doing it while I was still in the basement. I started paying closer attention to other sounds in the house. The coffee maker would turn on at 3:15 every morning, which was when I typically made my second pot of coffee. But I had not turned it on. I would hear the familiar beep of the microwave around 4 o'clock, the exact time I usually heated up leftover dinner. Cabinet doors would open and close in the kitchen following the pattern of my usual snack preparation. The most unnerving part was hearing my own routine being performed upstairs while I sat in the basement doing my job. It was like listening to a recording of my normal night, except I was not the one making those sounds. Someone else was moving through my house, opening my cabinets, using my appliances, and following my schedule with disturbing precision. I began documenting everything, writing down the exact times I heard footsteps, appliance sounds, and cabinet doors. The pattern was incredibly consistent. Every sound happened at the precise time I would normally make that movement or use that appliance. Whoever was in my house had been watching me long enough to memorize my entire routine. The footsteps were always the same weight and pace as my own. The coffee maker ran for exactly the same duration I typically used. Even the microwave would beep for the same number of times I usually set it for. This level of detail suggested someone had been observing me for weeks or months, learning every aspect of my nightly habits. I installed a security camera in the kitchen, angled to capture the main walking area where I heard most of the sounds. The first night with the camera, I watched my monitors while simultaneously listening to the familiar footstep pattern above me. But when I checked the kitchen camera feed, the room was completely empty. No movement, no person, nothing to explain the sounds I was clearly hearing. This continued for several more nights, hearing detailed activity upstairs while seeing absolutely nothing on the camera. I started to question my sanity, wondering if the isolation and night shift work were causing some kind of auditory hallucinations. But the sounds were too specific, too consistent, and too closely matched to my routine to be imaginary. I decided to test the situation by changing my routine slightly. Instead of taking my break at 3 in the morning, I waited until 3:30. The footsteps upstairs adjusted to match my new timing. When I made coffee at 3:45 instead of 3:15, I heard the coffee maker turn on upstairs at exactly 3:45. Whoever was in my house was not following a memorized schedule. They were actively watching me and mimicking my movements in real time. This meant they had visual access to my basement office and could see when I stood up, when I walked toward the stairs, and when I performed specific actions. I spent an entire night searching for hidden cameras or other surveillance equipment in the basement, but found nothing. The house had been thoroughly renovated before we moved in, with new electrical work and updated systems, so it seemed unlikely that someone had installed monitoring devices during construction. The breakthrough came when I decided to remain completely still during my usual break time. I sat in my chair, did not make coffee, did not go upstairs, and did not follow any part of my normal routine. For the first time in weeks, the house remained silent. No footsteps, no appliances, no cabinet doors. Whoever was upstairs was clearly responding to my actions, not following a predetermined script. I realized that someone had been living in my house, hiding somewhere during the day when my grandmother and I were active, and emerging at night to shadow my movements. They had learned my routine so perfectly that they could anticipate my actions and move through the house while staying just out of sight. The next night, I pretended to start my normal routine but stopped halfway through. I walked toward the stairs as if going to the kitchen, then quietly returned to my monitors. Within seconds, I heard footsteps upstairs moving toward the kitchen. Someone was definitely following me, staying one room ahead to avoid detection. I called the police and explained the situation, though I knew it sounded bizarre. 2 officers came to investigate and conducted a thorough search of the house. They found evidence that someone had been living in the crawl space above the main floor ceiling, a small area accessible through the attic that provided a perfect hiding spot with visual access to most rooms through gaps in the old ceiling. The space contained blankets, food containers, and a small notebook filled with detailed observations about my grandmother's and my daily schedules. The notes included precise timing of when we slept, when we were out of the house, what we ate, and even personal conversations we had had in the kitchen. Someone had been watching and documenting our lives for months. They also found a small hole drilled in the basement ceiling that provided a clear view of my computer setup. This explained how the intruder could monitor my work routine and mimic my movements with such accuracy. They had been watching me work every night, learning my habits, and then performing a shadow version of my routine in the rooms above. The intruder was never caught, but evidence suggested they had been accessing the house through a loose attic vent that connected to the roof. They probably entered during the day when we were both occupied and hid in the crawl space until nighttime. The setup was sophisticated and suggested someone with construction knowledge who understood how to move through houses without detection. We installed proper security throughout the house, sealed all potential entry points, and added motion sensors in areas that had previously been unmonitored. My grandmother was shaken by the revelation that someone had been living above her bedroom for months, watching her sleep and documenting her routine. The most disturbing aspect was realizing that this person had no interest in stealing anything or causing immediate harm. They seemed content to observe, document, and mimic our lives while remaining hidden. The notebook contained months of detailed observations about our habits, preferences, and schedules, suggesting a level of obsession that went far beyond typical breaking and entering. I eventually had to change jobs because I could not focus on security monitoring while worrying about who might be watching me. Every sound in the house made me wonder if someone was hiding nearby, learning my new routine and preparing to begin their shadow performance again. The violation of having someone secretly live in your home, watching your most private moments, changes your relationship with safety and privacy permanently. Even now, in a different house with better security, I still listen carefully during my breaks, wondering if those familiar footsteps might return to echo my movements from somewhere just out of sight. My name is Sofia Martinez, and I am an art student from the University of New Mexico. Last September, I rented a small cabin in the mountains outside Albuquerque for a month-long independent study project. The isolation was exactly what I needed to focus on my painting. but it also made me the perfect target for someone with very disturbing intentions. The cabin was about 30 minutes from the nearest town, nestled in a grove of pine trees with large windows that provided beautiful natural light for my artwork. It was a single-story structure with a wraparound porch, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a spacious living area that I had converted into my studio space. The owner was an elderly woman who lived in Santa Fe and rented the property to artists and writers seeking creative solitude. I had been there for about a week when I first noticed that something felt wrong. It was subtle at first, just a feeling of being watched that I initially attributed to the isolation and unfamiliar surroundings. But as the days passed, the sensation grew stronger, especially when I was working near the large windows that faced the forest. The cabin had windows on all sides, and I loved the feeling of being surrounded by nature while I painted. During the day, I kept most of the curtains open to maximize the natural light. But at night, those same windows became sources of anxiety. The darkness outside seemed to press against the glass, and I found myself checking and rechecking the locks before going to bed. About 10 days into my stay, I discovered the first piece of evidence that my unease was justified. While walking around the cabin one morning to stretch my legs, I noticed footprints in the soft soil beneath the living room windows. They were clearly fresh, made sometime during the night when the ground was still damp from an evening rain shower. The prints were from men's boots, size 10 or 11, and they formed a pattern that suggested someone had been standing at the window for an extended period. There were deeper impressions where the person had shifted their weight, indicating they had remained in that spot for quite some time. The positioning of the prints showed that whoever made them had been looking directly into my improvised studio where I spent most of my time. I called the property owner, Mrs. Gutierrez, to report the footprints, but she seemed unconcerned. She suggested it might have been a maintenance worker checking on the property, or perhaps a hiker who had gotten lost and was looking for help. Her casual dismissal made me question whether I was overreacting, but the footprints were definitely deliberate and purposeful, not the random marks of someone passing by. That night, I made sure all curtains were tightly closed before settling into work. But around 11 o'clock, I heard a soft tapping sound coming from the direction of the kitchen window. It was rhythmic and gentle, like someone lightly drumming their fingers against the glass. When I crept toward the kitchen to investigate, the tapping stopped immediately. I stood in the darkened kitchen for several minutes, listening intently, but heard nothing more. When I finally worked up the courage to peek through a gap in the curtains, I saw nothing but darkness and the silhouettes of trees. But the timing was too perfect. The tapping had stopped the exact moment I approached the window, suggesting that whoever was outside could see my movements inside the cabin. The next day brought a discovery that made my blood run cold. While taking my morning walk around the property, I found a small digital camera partially hidden in the bushes near the bedroom window. It was camouflaged with green tape and positioned to capture a clear view of the room where I slept. The camera was still recording, its tiny red light blinking steadily. My hands shook as I examined the device. It was a trail camera, the type used by hunters to monitor wildlife, but it had been modified and carefully positioned to spy on the cabin. The angle and placement showed that whoever put it there had intimate knowledge of the cabin's layout and my daily routines. They knew which room I slept in and had positioned the camera for maximum surveillance. I immediately called the sheriff's department, and Deputy Rodriguez arrived within an hour. He took the camera as evidence and conducted a thorough search of the property. We found 2 more cameras, one near the living room window where I did my painting, and another positioned to monitor the front entrance and my car. The cameras had been recording for at least a week, capturing footage of me arriving, unpacking, setting up my studio, and going about my daily routine. Deputy Rodriguez explained that this level of surveillance suggested someone was not just randomly spying, but was specifically targeting me and studying my habits for some unknown purpose. The most disturbing discovery came when we examined the memory cards from the cameras. They contained hours of footage showing me working, sleeping, cooking, and moving through the cabin completely unaware that I was being watched. But there were also videos taken from inside the cabin showing that someone had been entering the property while I was away. The interior footage showed a man in his 40s wearing dark clothing and gloves moving through my living space with disturbing familiarity. He went through my belongings, examined my paintings, and spent considerable time looking through my personal items. In one video, he was sitting on my bed holding one of my sweaters and bringing it to his face. Deputy Rodriguez identified the man as someone with a history of stalking and breaking into properties rented by young women. His name was David Kellerman, and he had been arrested twice before for similar behavior in Colorado and Arizona. He specifically targeted isolated rental properties where single women stayed alone, using surveillance equipment to study their routines before escalating to break-ins. The investigation revealed that Kellerman had been watching the cabin for weeks before I arrived, waiting for the right tenant. He had somehow gained access to the rental listings and specifically chose properties rented by young women who would be staying alone for extended periods. My artist residency made me a perfect target because he knew I would be isolated and focused on my work. Police found his campsite about half a mile from the cabin, hidden in a dense area of forest. He had been living there for over a month, equipped with sophisticated surveillance equipment, camping gear, and detailed notes about my daily activities. His notebook contained my schedule, descriptions of my appearance, and disturbing personal observations about my habits and preferences. The campsite also contained photographs that he had taken of me through the cabin windows, printed on a portable printer. Some were taken during the day while I was painting, others at night when I was getting ready for bed. The photos were organized chronologically and included written comments about my appearance and activities that made it clear this was not random voyeurism, but an obsessive fixation. Kellerman was arrested 2 days later at a gas station in town where he was purchasing supplies. The police found additional surveillance equipment in his truck, along with cable ties, duct tape, and other items that suggested his intentions went far beyond simple observation. Deputy Rodriguez told me that based on the evidence, they believed he was planning to eventually approach or confront me directly. During questioning, Kellerman admitted to stalking multiple women in similar situations over the past 5 years. He would identify isolated rental properties, conduct surveillance for weeks, and then escalate to breaking in and spending time in their living spaces while they were away. In some cases, he had been living in or near rental properties simultaneously with his victims for weeks without their knowledge. The psychological evaluation revealed that Kellerman was obsessed with the idea of sharing living spaces with women without their consent. He derived satisfaction from being close to them, learning their habits, and infiltrating their private lives while remaining undetected. The cameras allowed him to feel connected to his victims even when he was not physically present. I had to cut my residency short and return to Albuquerque, but the experience left me with lasting trauma that affected my ability to work alone or stay in isolated locations. The knowledge that someone had been watching me sleep, documenting my movements, and entering my living space while I was gone created a violation of privacy that took months of therapy to address. The case went to trial 6 months later, and Kellerman was sentenced to 8 years in prison for stalking, breaking and entering, and violation of all privacy. But knowing he is locked up does not erase the memory of seeing those photographs of myself taken without my knowledge, or the realization that someone had been sharing my living space and studying my life with such obsessive detail. Mrs. Gutierrez installed comprehensive security systems at the cabin and now screens tenants more carefully. But she told me that the experience made her reconsider renting to single women staying alone. The isolation that makes these properties attractive to artists and writers also makes them ideal hunting grounds for predators who know how to exploit vulnerability and privacy. I still paint, but I no longer work near large windows or stay in isolated locations alone. The art that was supposed to come from solitude and natural beauty instead came from the terrifying knowledge that privacy is often just an illusion, and that the most dangerous watchers are the ones you never know are there. My name is Jackson Miller, and I am 17 years old from Burlington, Vermont. What happened to me last fall during my uncle's business trip still makes me question how well we really know the people we trust. I was house sitting for my Uncle David, who lives in a quiet residential neighborhood about 15 minutes from where my parents and I live. He had asked me to stay at his place for 2 weeks while he traveled to Europe for work, taking care of his elderly cat and making sure the house looked occupied. Uncle David lived alone in a modest 2-story colonial house on Maple Street, surrounded by families who had been neighbors for years. It was the kind of neighborhood where people knew each other's names, borrowed lawnmowers, and looked out for one another. Before leaving, my uncle introduced me to several neighbors and gave them my phone number in case any problems arose while he was away. The most helpful of these neighbors was Mr. Peterson, a man in his 50s who lived 3 houses down. He worked from home as some kind of consultant and seemed to know everyone in the neighborhood. Uncle David told me that Mr. Peterson was incredibly reliable and had helped with various house projects over the years. He had a key to the house for emergencies and had offered to check on me periodically while I was staying there alone. For the first few days, everything went smoothly. I attended school during the day and returned to Uncle David's house in the evening to do homework, feed the cat, and maintain my normal routine. Mr. Peterson stopped by twice during that first week, once to bring me some homemade cookies from his wife and another time to check that the heating system was working properly. I appreciated his attention and kindness, especially since I was still adjusting to sleeping in an unfamiliar house. Mr. Peterson seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being and made sure I had his phone number in case I needed anything. He mentioned several times that I should not hesitate to call him, even in the middle of the night, if anything seemed wrong or if I felt unsafe. By the end of the first week, Mr. Peterson's visits had become a daily occurrence. He would stop by every evening around 6 o'clock, always with some practical reason. Checking the mail, inspecting the exterior lights, or bringing me food that his wife had prepared. While I was grateful for the attention, I started to notice that his visits were lasting longer and that he seemed particularly interested in my daily schedule. He would ask detailed questions about my school hours, what time I usually got home, whether I had plans for the weekend, and if any friends or family members were planning to visit. At first, I assumed he was just being thorough about neighborhood security, but gradually I realized that his questions were more specific than necessary for simple safety concerns. Mr. Peterson also began commenting on things that suggested he had been observing the house more closely than I had realized. He mentioned noticing that I kept late hours on weekends, that I had been watching television in the living room until nearly midnight, and that I had received several packages during the week. These observations required more surveillance than casual neighborly attention. The situation became genuinely unsettling when Mr. Peterson started letting himself into the house without knocking. He would use his emergency key and appear in the kitchen while I was doing homework or watching television, always with some excuse about checking on the furnace or investigating a strange noise he had heard. The first few times I accepted his explanations, but the frequency and timing of these unannounced visits made me increasingly uncomfortable. What disturbed me most was that Mr. Peterson always seemed to know exactly when I was home alone and when I would be arriving from school. He would appear within minutes of my return from school or emerge from somewhere in the house just as I was settling in for the evening. This level of timing suggested that he was monitoring my movements much more closely than appropriate. I started paying attention to Mr. Peterson's behavior and noticed details that should have alarmed me earlier. He knew which lights I typically turned on in the evenings, what I usually ate for dinner, what television programs I watched, and even what time I usually went to bed. This knowledge required observation that went far beyond casual neighborly interest. One evening, I decided to test my growing suspicion by varying my routine. Instead of coming straight home from school, I went to the library and stayed until nearly 8 o'clock. When I finally arrived at Uncle David's house, Mr. Peterson was waiting in his driveway and immediately approached me, asking why I was so late and whether everything was all right. His concern seemed excessive for someone who was simply watching out for me, and his knowledge of my usual schedule was too precise to be casual observation. I realized that Mr. Peterson had been tracking my daily movements with an attention to detail that crossed the line from helpful neighbor to something much more concerning. The breakthrough came when I found evidence that Mr. Peterson had been entering the house regularly when I was at school. I had started leaving small objects in specific positions before leaving in the morning. A book placed at a particular angle, a coffee cup positioned precisely on the counter, a magazine folded to a specific page. Each day, these items had been moved slightly, indicating that someone was spending time in the house while I was away. I also discovered that food was disappearing from the refrigerator in small amounts, and that the television was warm when I returned home, suggesting it had been used during the day. Someone was clearly making themselves comfortable in the house while I was at school, and Mr. Peterson was the only person with a key and detailed knowledge of my schedule. The most disturbing discovery came when I found a notebook hidden in the basement that contained detailed observations about my daily routine, personal habits, and even physical descriptions of my appearance and behavior. The handwriting was not Uncle David's, and the observations were far too detailed and personal to be innocent neighborhood watch activities. The notebook contained entries spanning several weeks, including dates before I had even arrived to house sit. This meant that whoever was writing these observations had been planning something involving me for quite some time. The entries included comments about my vulnerability, my isolation from family, and speculation about my personal relationships that made it clear this was not innocent surveillance. I called my parents immediately and explained the situation. They drove over that night and helped me search the house more thoroughly. We found additional evidence that someone had been using the house regularly, including personal items that did not belong to Uncle David and modifications to the basement that created a small living space behind the furnace. When we called the police, they took the situation very seriously. Detective Williams explained that using emergency access to enter someone's home for unauthorized surveillance was a serious crime, especially when it involved monitoring a minor. The notebook provided clear evidence of stalking behavior that had escalated to the point of illegal entry and invasion of privacy. The police arrested Mr. Peterson the next morning when they found him in Uncle David's house while I was at school. He had been using his emergency key to enter the property daily, sometimes spending several hours inside while I was away. He had created a comfortable setup in the basement where he could monitor my activities and document his observations about my routine and behavior. During questioning, Mr. Peterson admitted that he had been planning this surveillance for months, waiting for an opportunity when Uncle David would be away and I would be staying alone. He had volunteered to be the neighborhood contact specifically so he could gain access to the house and monitor me without suspicion. His helpful neighbor persona was entirely calculated to gain trust and access. The investigation revealed that Mr. Peterson had a history of similar behavior involving other young people in previous neighborhoods. He would identify vulnerable situations where teenagers were staying alone and position himself as a helpful adult figure while secretly conducting surveillance and documenting their personal lives. In 2 previous cases, his behavior had escalated to physical confrontation when his victims had become suspicious. Mr. Peterson was charged with stalking, breaking and entering, invasion of privacy, and endangering the welfare of a minor. The case went to trial 8 months later, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. But the psychological impact of learning that someone I trusted had been secretly living in the house and monitoring my every move took much longer to process. Uncle David was devastated to learn that someone he had trusted with his home and my safety had been using that trust to prey on me. He installed a complete security system and changed all the locks, but he also struggled with the guilt of having unknowingly facilitated the surveillance by providing access and legitimacy to someone with dangerous intentions. The experience taught me that predators often use positions of trust and authority to gain access to their victims. Mr. Peterson's Helpful Neighbor Act was perfectly designed to deflect suspicion while providing unlimited access to monitor and document my personal life. The most dangerous people are often those who appear most trustworthy and helpful, because their position makes it difficult to question their motives until the behavior becomes undeniably inappropriate. Even now, I am suspicious of adults who seem overly interested in my schedule or who position themselves as helpful figures without clear reasons for their attention. That false sense of security and trust can be more dangerous than obvious threats because it prevents victims from recognizing danger until the situation has already escalated beyond appropriate boundaries. My name is Avery Thompson, and I work remotely from my apartment in Boise, Idaho as a graphic designer. The flexibility of working from home has always been one of my favorite aspects of my job. But what happened to me last month made me realize how that routine can make you vulnerable to people with dangerous intentions. I live alone in a ground-floor apartment in a quiet complex near the University District. The building has about 20 units, and most residents are either graduate students or young professionals like myself. The complex has a secure entry system, but delivery drivers are typically buzzed in without much scrutiny, especially during the day when most people are expecting packages. My work involves frequent online orders, art supplies, computer equipment, and various materials for client projects. I probably receive packages 3 or 4 times a week, which has become such a normal part of my routine that I barely pay attention to delivery schedules anymore. Most drivers just leave packages outside my door with a quick knock or ring of the doorbell. 3 weeks ago, I noticed that my deliveries were becoming more frequent and coming at unusual times. I would find packages on my doorstep that I had not ordered, usually small items like office supplies or household goods. At first, I assumed there was some mix-up with addresses or that my upstairs neighbor was having items delivered to the wrong unit. The packages were always addressed to me, though, with my correct name and apartment number. When I checked my credit card statements and online accounts, I could not find any record of having ordered these items. I called a few of the shipping companies to report the error, but they insisted the items had been legitimately ordered from my address using valid payment information. After about a week of mysterious deliveries, I decided to stay home one day and watch for the delivery driver to see if I could figure out what was happening. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my doorbell rang and I immediately went to answer it. Standing outside was a man in a delivery uniform holding a small package. He was in his 30s, average height, with dark hair and an overly friendly demeanor that seemed forced. When I opened the door, he smiled broadly and said he had been making deliveries to my apartment for several weeks and wanted to make sure I was satisfied with the service. He asked detailed questions about my work schedule, whether I was usually home during the day and if I lived alone. The questions felt intrusive, but I assumed he was just being thorough about delivery logistics. I mentioned that I worked from home most days and that packages could be left outside my door if I was not available to answer. He seemed pleased by this information and lingered outside my apartment for several more minutes, making small talk about the neighborhood and complimenting my apartment's location. After he left, I realized that legitimate delivery drivers rarely have extended conversations with recipients or ask personal questions about living situations. His interest in my schedule and living arrangements seemed excessive for someone just delivering packages. I also noticed that he had been looking past me into my apartment while we talked, scanning the interior as if assessing the layout. Over the next few days, the mysterious packages continued arriving, but now I paid closer attention to the delivery process. I noticed that the same driver was making all the deliveries, even though the packages came from different companies that should have been using different shipping services. This suggested that someone was specifically arranging for the same person to have repeated access to my building and apartment. I started keeping track of delivery times and noticed they were becoming more frequent and occurring at specific times when I had previously mentioned being home. If I had told him I usually took lunch breaks around noon, packages would arrive right around 12 o'clock. If I had mentioned working late on certain projects, deliveries would come in the evening hours. The breakthrough came when I decided to install a small security camera near my door to monitor delivery activity. The first day with the camera, I captured footage that made my blood run cold. The delivery driver was not just dropping off packages and leaving. He was using some kind of tool to manipulate my door lock and spending several minutes inside my apartment while I was out. The video showed him entering my apartment, walking through the rooms and examining my personal belongings with disturbing familiarity. He went through my desk drawers, looked at photographs, and spent considerable time in my bedroom, opening closets and examining clothing. He was clearly using the delivery visits as opportunities to case my apartment and learn about my personal life. I immediately called the police and showed them the security footage. Detective Morrison took the case very seriously and explained that using delivery services to gain access to homes was an increasingly common tactic used by burglars and stalkers. The fake packages provided legitimate cover for repeated visits and allowed the perpetrator to study potential victims and their routines. The investigation revealed that the man was not actually employed by any of the shipping companies whose uniforms he wore. His name was Robert Chen, and he had been purchasing delivery uniforms online and creating fake packages to gain access to apartment complexes throughout the city. He specifically targeted young women who lived alone and worked from home. Police found his apartment filled with stolen items from dozens of homes, photographs of women taken without their knowledge, and detailed notes about the daily routines of potential victims. He had been conducting this scheme for over a year, using fake deliveries to identify vulnerable targets, and then escalating to burglary or worse. Chen's notes about me were particularly disturbing. He had documented my work schedule, social activities, and even personal habits like what I typically wore around the apartment. He knew when I usually showered, when I ordered food, and when I was most likely to be distracted by work projects. He had been planning something much more serious than simple burglary. The investigation revealed that Chen had a history of sexual assault charges in another state and had been using the delivery scheme to identify and monitor potential victims. Several other women came forward after his arrest, reporting similar experiences with mysterious packages and overly friendly delivery drivers who asked too many personal questions. Chen had been using the fake deliveries to gradually desensitize victims to his presence and gather information about their vulnerabilities. The packages created a sense of routine and familiarity that made his frequent visits seem normal and legitimate. By the time victims became suspicious, he already had detailed knowledge of their homes and schedules. The most disturbing aspect was learning that Chen had been planning to escalate his behavior. Police found detailed plans for home invasions, including information about which victims would be easiest to overpower and which apartments provided the best opportunities for assault without detection. My security camera had likely prevented a much more serious crime. Chen was arrested and charged with burglary, stalking, identity theft, and possession of stolen property. During the investigation, police linked him to over 30 similar cases across 3 states. He had been using the fake delivery scheme to commit crimes for several years, always moving to new areas when local police began investigating suspicious delivery patterns. The case went to trial 6 months later, and Chen was sentenced to 12 years in prison. But the psychological impact of learning that someone had been systematically infiltrating my personal space and planning to assault me was devastating. I had to move to a different apartment and completely change my work routine and online ordering habits. I now verify all deliveries before accepting packages, require identification from all delivery personnel, and never provide personal information about my schedule or living situation to strangers. I also installed comprehensive security equipment and changed my delivery address to a secure pickup location rather than having items sent directly to my home. The experience taught me that predators are constantly evolving their tactics to exploit new vulnerabilities created by modern conveniences. The rise of online shopping and frequent deliveries has created opportunities for criminals to gain legitimate access to private spaces while appearing to provide normal services. What made Chen's scheme so effective was that delivery drivers are expected to be in residential areas, asking about schedules and having access to buildings and apartments. His fake packages provided perfect cover for surveillance and infiltration activities that would otherwise be obviously suspicious. Even now, I feel anxious whenever my doorbell rings unexpectedly or when delivery drivers ask questions beyond basic logistics. The violation of having someone systematically infiltrate my personal space while pretending to provide a service has permanently changed how I interact with strangers and how much personal information I share in casual conversations. The case highlighted how criminals are adapting to exploit the trust and convenience that modern life depends on, turning everyday interactions into opportunities for predatory behavior that can escalate to serious violence. My name is Dakota Kim, and I am a 20-year-old college student at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. What happened to me last spring during my recovery from ACL surgery still haunts me and has completely changed how I view healthcare workers and the trust we place in people who enter our homes during vulnerable times. I had torn my ACL playing intramural soccer in February, requiring reconstructive surgery that left me bedridden for several weeks with limited mobility. My parents lived in California, so they arranged for a home health aide through a reputable medical agency to help me with daily tasks while I recovered in my off-campus apartment near the university. The apartment was a small one-bedroom place that I normally shared with my roommate Jessica, but she had moved out temporarily to do an internship in Atlanta. This meant I would be alone with whatever healthcare worker the agency assigned to me, which made my parents nervous but seemed necessary given my limited mobility and the pain medication that left me drowsy and disoriented. The agency sent someone named Marcus Williams, a man in his early 30s who had excellent credentials and references from previous clients. He was professional during our initial meeting, explaining his experience with post-surgical care and outlining a schedule for helping me with meals, medication management, and physical therapy exercises. He seemed competent and caring, which put both my parents and me at ease. For the first week, Marcus followed his schedule perfectly. He would arrive at 8 in the morning, help me shower and get dressed, prepare meals, assist with my physical therapy routine, and handle household tasks that I could not manage on crutches. He was professional, respectful of my privacy, and genuinely seemed invested in helping me recover quickly. The arrangement was supposed to last for 3 weeks until I could manage independently, but by the second week, Marcus began suggesting changes to the schedule that made me uncomfortable. He proposed staying overnight so he could monitor my pain levels and help if I needed assistance during the night. When I declined, he insisted that his other clients always appreciated having 24-hour care. Marcus also began asking increasingly personal questions about my social life, relationships, and family finances. He wanted to know if I had a boyfriend who might visit, whether my parents planned to check on me, and how much money I had access to for medical expenses. These questions seemed excessive for someone providing basic healthcare assistance. By the third week, Marcus had established a pattern of arriving earlier than scheduled and staying later than necessary. He would let himself in using the key I had given him and often be in my apartment when I woke up, claiming he wanted to check on me during the night. When I expressed discomfort with this arrangement, he assured me it was standard procedure for patients on strong pain medication. The situation became genuinely alarming when I discovered that Marcus had been going through my personal belongings while I slept. I found my laptop moved to different locations, dresser drawers slightly open, and personal documents that had been disturbed. When I confronted him about this, he claimed he was looking for my medication schedule and insurance information to better coordinate my care. Marcus also began making comments about my appearance and recovery that crossed professional boundaries. He would compliment my body during physical therapy sessions, make suggestive remarks about helping me bathe, and ask detailed questions about my intimate relationships that had no relevance to my medical care. When I tried to redirect these conversations, he would claim he was just being friendly and trying to keep my spirits up. The breaking point came when I woke up one night to find Marcus sitting in my bedroom chair watching me sleep. He claimed he was checking on my breathing and pain levels, but when I asked him to leave, he became defensive and insisted that monitoring patients during sleep was part of his job responsibilities. His presence in my bedroom at 3 in the morning felt predatory and inappropriate. I called the home health agency the next morning to request a different aide, but Marcus intercepted the call, taking the phone from me and speaking to his supervisor privately. He told me afterward that the agency was satisfied with his care and that changing aides mid-treatment would disrupt my recovery progress. He also mentioned that filing complaints could affect my insurance coverage and delay my return to school. That afternoon, while Marcus was supposedly running errands, I called the agency directly from my cell phone. The supervisor I spoke with had no record of Marcus calling them and seemed surprised by my description of his behavior. When I detailed his overnight stays, personal questions, and invasive monitoring, she immediately expressed concern and said this was not standard protocol for their aides. The supervisor explained that Marcus was only authorized to provide daytime care and should never have been staying overnight or accessing my apartment outside of scheduled hours. She also confirmed that going through patients' personal belongings and making inappropriate comments were serious violations of their professional standards. She promised to investigate immediately and send a replacement aide within 24 hours. When Marcus returned that evening, I told him that the agency was sending someone else to complete my care. His reaction was immediate and frightening. He became angry, defensive, and insisted that I was overreacting to normal healthcare procedures. He claimed that all his previous clients had been grateful for his dedicated attention and that I was being ungrateful for the extra care he provided. Marcus refused to leave my apartment that night, claiming he needed to properly transition my care to the new aide and that abandoning a patient mid-treatment would be irresponsible. When I insisted he leave, he became increasingly agitated and began making veiled threats about my safety and recovery. He implied that without his protection, I was vulnerable to break-ins or accidents. I managed to call 911 while Marcus was in the bathroom, and 2 police officers arrived within 15 minutes. When they asked Marcus to explain his presence in my apartment after being dismissed, he claimed there had been a misunderstanding and that he was still officially assigned to my case. However, when the officers called the agency, they confirmed that Marcus had been immediately suspended pending investigation. The police escorted Marcus from my apartment, but he returned 2 hours later using the key I had forgotten to retrieve from him. I was awakened by sounds in the kitchen and found him preparing food, claiming he was concerned about my nutrition and wanted to make sure I ate properly. The officers had to return and arrest him for criminal trespass in violation of a no-contact order. The investigation revealed that Marcus had a history of inappropriate behavior with female clients that the agency had either overlooked or inadequately investigated. 3 previous clients had filed complaints about boundary violations, unauthorized overnight stays, and invasive questioning, but Marcus had managed to explain away each incident as misunderstandings or necessary medical care. More disturbing was the discovery that Marcus had been photographing me while I slept and documenting personal details about my living situation, finances, and social connections. Police found his phone contained dozens of photos taken in my apartment without my knowledge, along with detailed notes about my daily routine, medication schedule, and periods of vulnerability. Marcus was charged with stalking, criminal trespass, invasion of privacy, and violation of professional standards. The Home Health Agency faced additional scrutiny for inadequate background checks and failure to properly investigate previous complaints. During the legal proceedings, 2 other women came forward with similar experiences involving Marcus's inappropriate behavior during their recovery periods. The psychological impact of having someone exploit my medical vulnerability was devastating. I had trusted Marcus with access to my home, my physical care, and my personal safety during one of the most helpless periods of my life. Learning that he had been documenting my vulnerability and photographing me without consent felt like a profound violation of the most basic human dignities. The case highlighted how medical professionals can exploit the trust and dependency that comes with home health care services. Patients recovering from surgery or managing chronic conditions are often isolated, medicated, and physically vulnerable, making them ideal targets for predators who use legitimate medical access to commit crimes. I had to complete my recovery with a different aid and additional security measures, but the experience left me with lasting anxiety about medical care and trusting healthcare workers in private settings. The violation of having someone exploit my physical helplessness and medical needs for predatory purposes created trust issues that affected my relationships with all healthcare providers. Marcus was sentenced to 18 months in prison and banned from working in healthcare, but the agency's failure to properly screen and monitor their employees raised broader questions about patient safety in home care situations. The case became part of a larger investigation into inadequate oversight of home health care workers and the vulnerability of patients who require in-home medical assistance. Even now, 2 years later, I remain hypervigilant about healthcare workers and never allow anyone to provide medical care in my home without additional oversight. The experience taught me that medical credentials and professional references cannot guarantee that someone will not exploit the trust and vulnerability that comes with providing intimate healthcare services. The most disturbing aspect was realizing that my physical recovery had been secondary to Marcus's personal agenda. He had used my medical needs as cover for stalking, surveillance, and exploitation, turning what should have been a healing process into a prolonged period of victimization that extended my vulnerability far beyond my original injury. My name is River Bennett, and I live in Salem, Oregon, in a small house about 10 minutes from downtown. What happened to me during a winter storm last January taught me that natural disasters create opportunities for predators who know how to exploit chaos and confusion to target vulnerable people. I am 23 years old and work as a freelance web developer, which means I spend most of my time at home working on my computer. I live alone in a modest single-story house in a quiet residential neighborhood where most of my neighbors are elderly or families with young children. It is the kind of place where people know each other by name and look out for one another, especially during emergencies. On January 15th, a massive ice storm hit the Pacific Northwest, bringing with it winds that knocked down power lines and tree branches throughout the region. By 8 o'clock that evening, my entire neighborhood had lost electricity, and the temperature inside my house was dropping rapidly as the heating system shut down. I had prepared for the storm by stocking up on flashlights, batteries, candles, and non-perishable food, but I had not anticipated how isolating and vulnerable the complete loss of power would make me feel. My cell phone had limited battery life, and with no internet or landline service, I was effectively cut off from the outside world. Around 10 o'clock, I heard someone knocking on my front door. When I looked through the peephole with my flashlight, I saw a man in what appeared to be an official utility company uniform holding a clipboard and wearing a hard hat. He identified himself as a power company technician conducting door-to-door checks to assess damage and estimate repair times. The man seemed legitimate. He knew specific details about the storm, mentioned that several transformers in the area had been damaged, and explained that crews were working around the clock to restore power. He asked if I was experiencing any electrical hazards like downed lines near my house or unusual smells that might indicate gas leaks. His questions seemed reasonable, and I was grateful that the utility company was being so thorough about checking on residents during the emergency. When he asked if I lived alone and whether I had adequate heating sources to get through the night, I told him I was managing well with blankets and a small camping stove for heating food. The technician, who said his name was Frank, explained that the power outage was expected to last at least 2 more days due to the extent of the damage. He offered to check my electrical panel to make sure there were no safety issues that could cause problems when power was restored, and suggested I might want to stay with family or friends if I did not have adequate heating. I appreciated his concern and allowed him to examine the electrical panel in my basement. He spent about 10 minutes looking at the breaker box with his flashlight, making notes on his clipboard and explaining that everything looked safe. Before leaving, he gave me his business card and said crews would return the next day to continue assessments. After Frank left, I felt reassured that professionals were handling the emergency situation. But about an hour later, I heard someone trying to open my back door. When I investigated with my flashlight, I could see the door handle being turned from the outside, and someone was definitely attempting to enter my house. I grabbed a kitchen knife and called out that I was armed and had already called the police. The attempted entry stopped immediately, but I could hear footsteps moving around the outside of my house. Someone was circling the property, testing windows and trying other potential entry points. My cell phone had very little battery remaining, but I managed to call 911 and report the attempted break-in. The dispatcher said multiple officers were responding to emergency calls throughout the city due to the storm, but someone would be sent to check on me as soon as possible. She advised me to remain inside and avoid confronting the intruder directly. While waiting for police, I heard the person continue to move around my house, testing windows and doors systematically. It became clear that whoever was outside was not randomly trying to break in, but was methodically checking every possible entry point as if they were familiar with standard residential security vulnerabilities. About 30 minutes later, I heard someone at my front door again, claiming to be Frank, returning to check on additional safety concerns. But this time his voice sounded different, and when I looked through the peephole, I could not see anyone in the darkness. The person was standing outside the range of my flashlight, which suggested they were deliberately trying to avoid being identified. I refused to open the door and told the person that police were on their way. Immediately, I heard rapid footsteps running away from the house, confirming that this was not a legitimate utility worker, but someone who was using the storm as cover for criminal activity. The police arrived about an hour later and conducted a thorough search of my property. They found evidence that someone had been attempting to pry open windows and had damaged the lock on my back door. Officer Martinez explained that power outages create ideal conditions for burglars who know that security systems are disabled and that residents are isolated and vulnerable. The business card that Frank had given me was fake. The utility company confirmed they were not conducting door-to-door checks and that all their crews were focused on repairing infrastructure, not individual assessments. The uniform and equipment he carried were easily purchased online and provided perfect cover for gaining access to homes during the emergency. Officer Martinez explained that criminals often monitor emergency services during natural disasters, listening to police scanners to identify areas where response times are delayed. They use official-looking uniforms and equipment to gain trust and access, then return later when they know residents are isolated and unable to call for help quickly. The investigation revealed that several homes in the area had been targeted during the storm using similar tactics. The perpetrator would pose as an emergency worker, utility technician, or relief volunteer to gain entry and assess homes for valuables and security weaknesses. He would then return later to commit burglaries when he knew residents were alone and cut off from communication. Police found the man 2 days later when power was restored and security cameras came back online. His name was Michael Torres, and he had an extensive criminal history of using natural disasters and emergencies to commit burglaries and home invasions. He specifically targeted areas where power outages disabled security systems and isolated residents from help. Torres had been monitoring emergency broadcasts and police communications to identify neighborhoods where power outages were expected to last multiple days. He would then pose as various types of emergency personnel to gain access to homes and gather information about residents, security systems, and valuable items that could be stolen later. The fake uniforms and equipment found in his possession were sophisticated and would have fooled most people during an emergency situation. He had uniforms for utility workers, emergency management personnel, and relief volunteers, along with clipboards, identification badges, and other props that made his impersonation convincing. During questioning, Torres admitted to targeting my house specifically because I had told him I lived alone and had valuable electronics for my work. He had planned to return after midnight when he knew I would be isolated and unable to call for help quickly due to limited cell phone battery and poor emergency response times during the storm. Torres was charged with attempted burglary, impersonating a public official, and criminal trespass. The investigation linked him to over 20 similar incidents across 3 states during various natural disasters over the past 2 years. He specifically targeted rural and suburban areas where residents were likely to trust official-looking personnel and where emergency response was delayed. The case highlighted how natural disasters create unique vulnerabilities that criminals actively exploit. The combination of disabled security systems, limited communication, delayed emergency response, and residents' increased willingness to trust people claiming to provide help creates ideal conditions for predatory behavior. I had to install battery backup systems for my security equipment and develop protocols for verifying the identity of anyone claiming to be emergency personnel. The experience taught me that criminals are often more organized and prepared for disasters than residents are, and they specifically plan to exploit the chaos and vulnerability that emergencies create. The psychological impact of having someone exploit my trust during a genuine emergency situation was particularly disturbing. Torres had used my natural desire to cooperate with authorities and accept help during a crisis to gather information that would have made me a victim of serious crimes later that night. Even now, I am suspicious of anyone who claims to be providing emergency services during disasters, and I always verify credentials through official channels before allowing anyone access to my home. The experience taught me that predators are often the best prepared people during emergencies because they have specifically planned to exploit the vulnerabilities that disasters create in normal security and communication systems. The storm that was supposed to bring my community together instead revealed how isolated and vulnerable we become when our normal safety networks fail, and how quickly criminals can exploit that vulnerability to target people who are just trying to survive difficult circumstances. Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you a descent into fear with 8 of the most disturbing true trucker horror stories ever documented. These accounts are not drawn from highway folklore or roadside legends, but from the lived ordeals of professional drivers whose nights on America's interstates became unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. Each story takes us deep into isolated highways and shadowed truck stops, revealing chilling encounters that span from unexplained radio transmissions to terrifying confrontations with forces both human and otherworldly. The testimonies have been meticulously preserved from first-hand accounts shared within the trucking community, ensuring that the authenticity of these experiences remains uncompromised, while driver names and specific routes have been altered to protect the privacy and safety of those involved. If you have not yet joined our growing community of horror enthusiasts, subscribe to Buried Files and activate the notification bell, so you never miss a single night when the unknown comes calling from the darkness between cities. Be sure to leave a comment below and tell us about your own highway experiences or which story disturbed you the most. I need to tell someone about what happened to me and my partner on a lonely stretch of highway in rural Texas 6 months ago. The authorities classified it as an attempted robbery, but that does not even come close to describing the organized nightmare we stumbled into that night. My name is Christopher, and I have been driving team with my partner Jake for 3 years. We thought we knew how to handle ourselves on the road, thought we understood the dangers that came with hauling valuable cargo through remote areas. We were wrong. It was a Tuesday night in late March, and we were hauling a load of electronics from Houston to Dallas. Nothing unusual about the run, just expensive enough that the company insisted on a team operation for security. Jake was sleeping in the bunk while I took the night shift, driving through the kind of empty Texas countryside where you can go 20 miles without seeing another vehicle. Around 2:45 a.m., I spotted what looked like a car accident about half a mile ahead. Emergency flashers were blinking on the shoulder, and I could see figures waving flashlights trying to flag down traffic. My first instinct was to help. In 15 years of trucking, I had stopped at dozens of accident scenes, pulled people out of burning cars, called for ambulances, done whatever I could to help fellow travelers in distress. But something about this scene felt wrong from the beginning. For one thing, there were too many people. A typical accident might have 2 or 3 individuals involved, maybe a passerby who had stopped to help. But I counted at least 6 figures moving around the disabled vehicle, which appeared to be a sedan tilted at an odd angle on the shoulder. The pattern of their movements was too coordinated, too purposeful for people who were supposedly dealing with an emergency. I slowed down and pulled into the right lane, intending to stop and offer assistance despite my growing unease. That is when I noticed the second red flag. The disabled car's hazard lights were flashing, but I could not see any actual damage. No crumpled fenders, no broken glass glittering on the asphalt. No sign of the impact that should have put the vehicle there. As I brought my rig to a stop about 50 yards from the scene, one of the figures jogged toward my cab. He was a tall man in his 30s, wearing jeans and a work shirt, carrying a flashlight and moving with the kind of confident stride that comes from being in complete control of a situation. "Thank God you stopped," he called as I rolled down my window. "We have got a real bad situation here. Driver is trapped and we need to get this car moved before another vehicle comes around that curve and plows into us." I woke Jake up and filled him in quickly while the man waited by my door. Jake climbed into the driver's seat to get a better look at the scene, and I could see him frowning as he studied the layout. "Something is not right about this," Jake whispered to me. "Look at how those other people are positioned. They are not trying to help with the car. They are watching the road in both directions like they are standing guard." I looked more carefully and realized Jake was absolutely right. The other figures were spread out in a defensive perimeter, some facing north, others south, all of them alert and watching for approaching traffic. It was the kind of formation you might see from a military unit or a well-trained criminal organization. "What kind of help do you need exactly?" I called down to the man by my window. "We need your truck to pull the car back onto the road," he replied smoothly. "Got a tow strap right here. Just take a minute and you will be on your way." That is when I noticed the third red flag. Despite supposedly dealing with a serious accident for God knows how long, none of these people looked stressed or hurried. Their clothes were clean, their movements calm and methodical. The man talking to me was not sweating, was not showing any signs of the adrenaline that comes with a genuine emergency. Jake made the decision for both of us. "We are going to call this in to the state police," he announced loudly enough for the man outside to hear. "They will have a tow truck out here within the hour." The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The man's friendly demeanor dropped away like a mask being removed. "I do not think you understand the situation," he said, his voice now cold and threatening. "We need your cooperation right now." That is when I saw the gun. He had been holding it low against his leg, hidden from view, but now he raised it until the barrel was pointing directly at my chest. At the same moment, the other figures around the disabled car stopped pretending to work on it and turned their attention fully toward our truck. "Driver, you need to shut off that engine and step out of the cab," the gunman ordered. "Both of you, hands where we can see them, no sudden movements." My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst, but years of training kicked in. Every trucking company drills their drivers on what to do in a hijacking situation. Comply with demands. Do not resist. Do not try to be a hero. The cargo is insured. The company would rather lose the load than lose their drivers. But Jake had different ideas. "Hold on tight," he whispered to me, then slammed the truck into gear and floored the accelerator. The gunman tried to jump clear as 40 tons of truck and trailer lurched forward, but Jake deliberately swerved toward him. I heard the man scream as he dove for the ditch, and then we were past the fake accident scene and accelerating down the highway. That should have been the end of it, but these people were not giving up easily. As we gained speed, I could see headlights in my mirrors. Multiple vehicles were pursuing us and they were gaining fast. "These guys are serious," Jake said through gritted teeth, pushing our loaded rig as hard as it would go. "This is not some random robbery, this is organized." The first vehicle caught up with us about 3 miles down the road. It was a pickup truck with 2 men in the cab, and they pulled alongside us on the left. The passenger was leaning out the window with what looked like a rifle, trying to get a clear shot at our tires. Jake swerved hard to the left, using our weight advantage to force the pickup off the road. I watched in the mirror as it spun out and rolled into the ditch, but there were still at least 2 more vehicles behind us. "There!" Jake pointed ahead to a cluster of lights about 5 miles in the distance. "That has got to be a town." If we can make it there, we can get help." The next few minutes were the most terrifying of my life. The remaining pursuit vehicles took turns trying to disable our truck, shooting at our tires, attempting to ram us from behind. Jake drove like a man possessed, using every ounce of his skill to keep us on the road and moving toward those distant lights. We were less than a mile from what we hoped was safety when disaster struck. One of the pursuing cars managed to get alongside us on the right, and I could see the driver gesturing for Jake to pull over. When Jake ignored him, the car suddenly swerved into us, trying to force us off the road. Jake overcorrected, and I felt our trailer start to jackknife. For a moment that seemed to last forever. We were sliding sideways down the highway at 60 miles per hour, the screaming of locked-up brakes filling the air. Then physics took over and our truck rolled. I remember the sensation of being thrown around the cab like a rag doll, the deafening crash of metal and glass, the acrid smell of diesel fuel and burning rubber. When the world finally stopped spinning, I was hanging upside down in my seat, blood running down my face from a dozen cuts. "Jake?" I called out, but there was no answer. I managed to unbuckle my seatbelt and fell to what was now the ceiling of the cab. Jake was unconscious, hanging limp in his restraints, blood pooling beneath his head. I could hear voices outside, the sound of footsteps crunching on broken glass. "Get them out of there," someone was shouting. "We need to make this look like an accident." That is when I realized these people intended to kill us. This had never been about just stealing our cargo. They wanted to eliminate the witnesses. I managed to kick out the windshield and crawl through the opening just as the first man reached the wreckage. In the darkness and confusion, he did not see me slip away into the tall grass beside the highway. From my hiding spot, I watched in horror as they pulled Jake's unconscious form from the cab. "This one is still breathing," one of them said. "Not for long," another replied. I wanted to help my partner, wanted to rush back and fight for his life, but I was outnumbered and unarmed. The only thing I could do was try to get help, assuming I could make it to town without being caught. The next hour was a nightmare of crawling through ditches, hiding in culverts, and trying to stay ahead of the search parties I could hear spreading out behind me. These people were professionals, organized and methodical in their pursuit. They had radios, they had night vision equipment, and they knew the terrain far better than I did. By sheer luck, I managed to reach the outskirts of the small town just as dawn was breaking. I stumbled into the first business I found open, a diner that served the early morning crowd, and collapsed at the counter. "Please," I gasped to the startled waitress, "and call the police." My partner. They took my partner. The state police response was immediate and massive. Within an hour, there were dozens of officers at the crash site, but it was too late. The hijackers had vanished, taking Jake with them and leaving behind only our overturned truck and a crime scene that told no clear story. The investigation lasted for months, but they never found Jake. The FBI believed we had stumbled into the territory of a sophisticated cargo theft ring that had been operating throughout Texas and Louisiana. The fake accident scene was just one of several methods they used to stop and rob commercial vehicles. But we were the first drivers who had tried to fight back. I learned later that there had been at least 12 similar hijackings over the previous 2 years, but in every other case, the drivers had cooperated and been released unharmed after their cargo was stolen. We were the exception, the ones who fought back, and Jake paid the price for our resistance. I quit team driving after that. I could not stand the thought of putting another partner at risk, could not bear the responsibility of making life and death decisions for someone else. I still drive, but only solo runs, and I avoid remote areas whenever possible. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice that night. If Jake and I had just surrendered quietly, would he still be alive today? The FBI agent assigned to the case told me that fighting back was the correct decision, that these criminals had probably killed drivers before and would have killed us regardless. But knowing that does not make the guilt any easier to carry. The worst part is not knowing what happened to Jake, not knowing if he suffered, if he had any final words, if he understood that I tried to save him. The not knowing eats at you in ways that definite knowledge, however terrible, never could. If you are a driver reading this, learn from my mistake. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Do not stop for accidents that look too neat, too organized. And if you do find yourself in a situation like ours, remember that your life is worth more than any cargo, no matter how valuable. This happened to me about 3 months ago, and I still have trouble sleeping some nights because of it. I have been driving trucks for over 15 years, and I thought I had seen everything the highway could throw at me. But that cold March night on Interstate 80 in Nevada taught me that the road still has secrets I never want to discover again. I was making my usual run from Sacramento to Salt Lake City. It was just past 3:20 a.m., and I was running on black coffee and pure stubbornness. The highway was empty, nothing but endless desert and the occasional coyote caught in my headlights. My Peterbilt was humming along nicely, the radio was playing some late-night blues, and I was settling into that comfortable rhythm every trucker knows. 6 more hours to my destination, and then I could grab some real food and maybe 8 hours of sleep. That is when I saw him. At first, my tired brain processed it as a mirage. There was no way anyone would be out here on foot at this hour, especially not in the middle of nowhere with nothing but salt flats and Joshua trees for miles. But as I got closer, the figure solidified into the unmistakable shape of a man with his thumb out, asking for a ride. I slowed down, my air brakes hissing as I pulled over onto the shoulder. Through 15 years of trucking, I had picked up plenty of hitchhikers. Most were just down on their luck, trying to get to the next town or find work. But something about this man made every instinct I had start screaming warnings. He jogged up to my cab window as I rolled it down just an inch. The man looked to be in his mid-40s, thin build, wearing jeans and a red flannel shirt with black work boots. But his skin had this washed-out, almost translucent quality, like he had never seen sunlight or was caught perpetually under fluorescent lighting. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and when they settled on me, I felt a chill run down my spine. "Where you headed?" I called through the glass. "East." "Anywhere east," he replied, his voice oddly flat and emotionless. Every fiber of my being told me to drive away, but the thought of leaving someone stranded in this desolate stretch weighed on my conscience. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the passenger door. He climbed in slowly, sitting rigidly upright and clutching a battered backpack. The scent that came with him was strange. It was not the smell of sweat or the road, but something sharp and antiseptic, like ammonia mixed with fresh paint. The cab temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees the moment he settled into the seat. I shifted back into drive and merged onto the highway, trying to make conversation. "Name is David," I offered. He nodded but did not return the greeting. Instead, he stared straight ahead through the windshield, his fingers gripping that beat-up pack like his life depended on it. I tried again. "Where exactly are you coming from?" The man shrugged, the slightest hint of what might have been a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Nowhere, really. Just traveling." The next 20 minutes passed in complete silence except for the steady drone of my engine and the rhythmic slap of tires on concrete. I found myself alternating between watching the empty highway ahead and sneaking cautious glances at my passenger. I had picked up enough hitchhikers over the years to recognize the signs. Some were running from trouble, others were just down on their luck. But this man went beyond nervous or cautious. There was something fundamentally wrong about him. That is when I noticed it in my mirrors. Out of habit, I checked my side mirror for what must have been the 100th time that night. What I saw made my blood turn to ice. The man sitting right beside me cast no reflection. In the dim glass, I could see the empty passenger seat, the dashboard lights, even the texture of the upholstery. But where my passenger should have been, there was absolutely nothing. I blinked hard, convinced that exhaustion was playing tricks on me. Not enough sleep, too much caffeine, maybe the stress of the long haul was finally getting to me. But every time I glanced at that mirror, the same impossible sight greeted me. Empty seat, no shadow, no shape, no reflection at all. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. I focused on the road ahead, trying to control the panic that was building in my chest. Stories my grandfather used to tell came flooding back. Tales from rural Arkansas about haints and lost souls, about the dead who walked between midnight and dawn, forever seeking rides to places they could never reach. The silence in the cab became suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, could feel cold sweat trickling down my back despite the heater running full blast. The rational part of my mind kept insisting there had to be an explanation. But every primal instinct I possessed was screaming that I was sharing my cab with something that should not exist. "I need to drop you at the next rest stop," I said finally. My voice carefully controlled despite the fear clawing at my throat. The man slowly turned his head to look directly at me. His gaze felt like ice water running through my veins. "That will not be necessary. I know exactly where I'm going." "You sure about that?" I managed to ask. "Positive," he replied, and his voice seemed to come from somewhere far away. Minutes crawled by like hours. The heater, which had been working perfectly, suddenly began blowing cold air. Frost started creeping along the edges of my windshield, and my breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid cabin. I grabbed my phone, hoping to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. The world outside had turned hostile and alien. Even the stars seemed to disappear behind a veil of darkness. Without thinking, I started whispering a prayer I remembered from childhood, words my grandmother had taught me for protection against things that go bump in the night. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the atmosphere in the cab shifted. The passenger spoke quietly, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "Take the next exit. I have people waiting for me." Ahead, an old and battered road sign emerged from the darkness. "Lonewell's Rest Area, half-mile." The green paint was faded and peeling, the reflective strips dulled with age. I pulled off the highway, my wheels crunching on the frost-covered gravel of what looked like an abandoned truck stop. The parking lot was completely empty, not a single other vehicle in sight. A retro neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie blue glow across a building that looked like it had been closed for years. All the windows were black as midnight. My passenger began to open the door, then paused and looked back at me. In that moment, his eyes changed. They became impossibly deep, glinting with a pale, otherworldly reflection that made my soul shudder. "Thank you for the ride, David," he said softly. "Keep your eyes on the road from now on. Some things are better left unseen." He stepped out and walked steadily toward the building. I watched in growing horror as the front doors, which should have been locked and chained, swung open soundlessly for him. He disappeared into the darkness beyond, and the doors closed behind him with no sound at all. I do not know how long I sat there, too terrified to move, my heart hammering against my ribs. Time seemed suspended in that moment, reality itself called into question. Then, like salvation breaking through a nightmare, headlights cut through the darkness. Another semi rolled into the lot and parked nearby. I practically fell out of my cab, desperate for contact with another living human being. The other driver stepped down, stretching after his long haul, then glanced toward the dark building. "Did you see a man go in there just now?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Red flannel shirt, black boots, carrying a backpack?" The driver shook his head, frowning with concern. "Buddy, I have not seen a soul here tonight. This place has been boarded up for years, completely abandoned on my last 3 runs through here." I turned back toward the building, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The front doors were chained shut from the outside, heavy chains and padlocks that looked like they had been there for decades. The neon sign had gone completely dark. There were no footprints in the frost-covered gravel, no sign that anyone had walked this way. Fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run, I crept closer and peered through a crack in the filthy glass. Inside, I could see only abandoned bathroom stalls, overturned chairs covered in dust, and the kind of silence that comes with years of emptiness. As dawn finally broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I climbed back into my cab. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had happened, trying to convince myself it had all been some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion and too much caffeine. But deep down, I knew better. I did not tell anyone about that night, not at first. But rumors have a way of spreading among truckers, stories shared over coffee and pie at all-night diners. Within weeks, other drivers were talking about sightings of a specter in red on that lonely stretch of I-80, always looking for a ride east, always disappearing without a trace. When I finally broke my silence at a truck stop outside Reno, an old woman driver named Mabel listened to my story without interruption. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "I have seen him too," she whispered, leaning closer across the worn Formica table. "They say he is always looking for a ride east, trying to get somewhere he can never reach." "Did he thank you when he left?" I thought about those final words, the way his eyes had changed, the gratitude in his voice that had seemed so genuine despite everything else. "Yes," I said. "He thanked me." "Then you are one of the lucky ones," she said, her weathered face serious. "Sometimes he does not." For months after that night, I avoided the Nevada stretch entirely, taking longer routes that added hours to my runs but kept me far from that cursed rest stop. I stopped picking up hitchhikers altogether and started carrying a small cross on my dashboard. But sometimes, on clear, cold nights when the moon hangs low and the highway stretches endlessly ahead, I swear I can still see a pale figure standing in the edge of my peripheral vision. He is always there and not there, waiting patiently for the next trucker willing to offer a ride to nowhere, forever seeking passage to a destination that exists somewhere between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. I still drive that road occasionally now, when the money is too good to pass up. But I never stop at rest areas after midnight, and I never look too closely in my mirrors on those long, dark stretches of highway. Some things, as my passenger warned me, are better left unseen. And if you ever find yourself driving through Nevada in the small hours of the morning and you see a lone figure with his thumb out on the side of the road, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. Trust me on this one. Some rides are not worth the risk. They're not. I have been an owner-operator for 8 years now, running routes through the Pacific Northwest, and I thought I knew every truck stop, every rest area, and every safe spot to park between Seattle and Portland. The forests up there are dense, ancient things that have been growing since before humans ever set foot in North America. Most of the time, they are beautiful in a way that takes your breath away. But sometimes, late at night when you are alone with nothing but darkness pressing against your windows, Those same forests can feel like they are hiding secrets that were never meant to be discovered. This happened to me last October during what should have been a routine delivery run from Tacoma to Eugene. I was hauling electronic components, nothing special, just another load that needed to get there on time. The weather had been acting up all week, with heavy rains making some of the mountain passes treacherous for big rigs. By the time I reached the halfway point of my route, I was running behind schedule, and my logbook was showing that I needed to take my mandatory rest break whether I wanted to or not. I pulled into a truck stop called Pine Ridge Rest Area, about 40 miles south of Olympia. It was one of those older facilities that the state had built back in the 70s, tucked away in a grove of massive Douglas fir trees that towered over the parking area like ancient sentinels. During the day, the place had a rustic charm that made it popular with tourists and RV travelers. But at night, especially on a cold October evening with fog rolling in from the coast, it felt isolated and somehow vulnerable. The parking area was nearly empty when I arrived around 11:30 p.m. Just my rig and a couple of cars that probably belonged to late shift workers heading home. The facility building was closed for the night, leaving only the vending machines and the exterior lighting to push back against the darkness that seemed to pour out of the surrounding forest like a living thing. I went through my usual routine, checking my load securement, doing a quick walk-around inspection, and settling into my sleeper berth with a sandwich and a thermos of coffee. The plan was simple: get my required 8 hours of rest, then hit the road early to make up for lost time. I had done this same routine hundreds of times before at dozens of different locations. It should have been just another night. But from the moment I climbed into my bunk, something felt wrong. The forest around the rest area was too quiet. I am used to the normal sounds of wilderness at night: owls calling, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, maybe the distant howl of a coyote. But this silence was absolute, as if every living creature in those woods had suddenly decided to hold its breath. Even the wind, which had been gusting all evening, had died down to nothing. I tried to convince myself it was just the weather, maybe the approaching fog bank that was muffling the usual forest sounds. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to the oppressive quiet, I began to feel like I was being watched. It started as just a feeling, that prickly sensation you get on the back of your neck when someone is staring at you. I checked my mirrors, scanned the parking lot through my windows, even got up to look outside. Nothing. Just empty pavement and the wall of trees beyond the reach of the security lights. Around 1:15 a.m. I heard the first sound. It was subtle at first, just the faintest whisper of movement in the undergrowth at the edge of the tree line, the kind of sound a deer might make stepping carefully through fallen leaves. But there was something about the rhythm of it that did not seem quite right. It was too deliberate, too measured, like something was trying very hard not to be heard. I sat up in my bunk and pressed my face to the window, straining to see into the darkness beyond the parking lot lights. The fog had grown thicker, creating shifting curtains of gray that made it impossible to see more than 30 feet in any direction. But I could swear I caught a glimpse of movement, something dark and tall moving between the trees. Over the next hour, the sounds grew more frequent and more disturbing. Footsteps circling my truck at a distance, always staying just outside the pool of light cast by the security fixtures. The snap of twigs being broken underfoot, and once what sounded unmistakably like breathing, deep and ragged, coming from somewhere very close to my driver's side door. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed into the cab, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the windshield, I could see the fog swirling in unnatural patterns, as if something large was moving through it just beyond the range of my vision. I hit my high beams, flooding the area in front of my truck with brilliant white light. For just a moment, I saw it clearly. The figure stood about 50 yards away at the very edge where the pavement met the forest floor. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with impossibly long limbs and a gaunt frame that seemed to bend and twist in ways that human joints simply do not allow. Its skin looked pale and mottled in the glare of my headlights, stretched tight over protruding bones. But it was the eyes that made my blood turn to ice water. They reflected my headlight beams like an animal's eyes, but they were too large, too intelligent, and filled with a hunger that I felt in the deepest part of my soul. The moment my lights hit it, the thing moved, not running like a person or even like an animal, but flowing through the fog with a fluid motion that defied everything I thought I knew about how living things are supposed to move. Within seconds, it had vanished back into the tree line, leaving me staring at empty forest and wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. But I knew I had not imagined it. Every survival instinct I possessed was screaming that I was in mortal danger. I reached for my CB radio to call for help, but all I got was static. My cell phone showed no signal, which was not unusual in this remote area, but the timing felt ominous. I was completely cut off from the outside world, alone with whatever was stalking me through those ancient trees. The next few hours were the longest of my life. The thing, whatever it was, continued to circle my truck like a predator testing the defenses of its prey. I could hear it moving through the underbrush, sometimes close enough that I was certain it was just outside my door. Other times retreating deeper into the forest only to return minutes later from a different direction. Around 3:30 a.m. it got bolder. I was lying in my sleeper berth, flashlight in one hand and my tire iron in the other, when I heard something that made my hair stand on end. Scratching sounds like claws being dragged across metal coming from somewhere above my head. The thing was on top of my trailer. The scratching moved slowly from the back of the trailer toward the front, each scrape of claw against metal sending vibrations through the entire rig. I could feel the truck swaying slightly under the weight of whatever was up there. When the sounds reached the area directly above my sleeper berth, they stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear breathing again. Slow, deliberate inhalations and exhalations that seemed far too large to come from human lungs. Then, without warning, something began tapping on the roof directly above where I lay. Not the random scratching of before, but a rhythmic pattern. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause. It was trying to communicate. Terror gave way to a surge of desperate courage. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed back into the cab, then rolled down my window and stuck my head out to look up at the roof of my trailer. The fog had thickened even more, but I could make out a dark shape hunched on the aluminum surface about 10 feet behind the cab. "What do you want?" I shouted into the night. The tapping stopped. For a long moment, the only sound was my own ragged breathing. Then the shape on my roof began to move again, sliding down the back of the trailer with the same unnatural fluidity I had witnessed earlier. Within seconds, it had dropped to the ground and disappeared into the fog. But I could still feel it watching me, waiting. As dawn finally began to break through the fog, painting the forest in shades of gray and pale yellow, I heard the sound of another vehicle pulling into the rest area. A state patrol car making its routine early morning check of the facility. I have never been so glad to see law enforcement in my entire life. The officer was a middle-aged woman named Sergeant Martinez, who had been patrolling this stretch of highway for 12 years. When I told her about my night, leaving out the more unbelievable details, she nodded grimly. "You are not the first trucker to report strange encounters at this location," she said, scanning the tree line with professional alertness. "We have had at least 6 similar reports over the past 2 years, always single drivers, always during the overnight hours." She walked around my truck, examining the scratches on the roof of my trailer. The metal was gouged in long parallel lines that looked like they had been made by claws, but claws much larger than any animal native to the Pacific Northwest. "What do you think made these marks?" I asked. Sergeant Martinez was quiet for a long moment, then looked directly at me. "Officially? Probably tree branches scraping against your trailer during the windstorm last night. Unofficially?" She paused, glancing back at the forest. "I have lived in this area my whole life, and there are things in these old woods that do not appear in any field guide or natural history book. My grandmother used to tell stories about creatures that the Quinault tribe called the Tall Walkers. Beings that were here long before the first European settlers, things that most people have forgotten how to see." Before I left that morning, Sergeant Martinez gave me some advice that I have never forgotten. "If you have to stop here again," she said, "do it during daylight hours. And if you see anything moving in those trees after dark, do not try to communicate with it. Some things are better left alone." I took her advice to heart. I have driven past Pine Ridge Rest Area dozens of times since that night, but I have never stopped there after sunset again. I have also started carrying more than just a tire iron for protection, though I doubt conventional weapons would do much good against something like what I encountered. Other truckers I have talked to have shared similar stories from remote areas throughout the Northwest. Sightings of tall, gaunt figures moving through old-growth forests. Encounters with things that walk upright but are definitely not human. Most drivers do not report these incidents officially, knowing how crazy they sound, but the stories spread through the trucking community anyway. I still run routes through the Pacific Northwest regularly. The money is good, and despite what happened, I love the rugged beauty of the region. But I have learned to be more careful about where I take my mandatory rest breaks. Some places are safe for travelers and others are not. The trick is knowing the difference before you find yourself alone in the dark with something that sees you not as a fellow living being, but as prey. The scratches on my trailer took 3 months to fade completely, and even now, almost a year later, I can still see faint marks if I know where to look. They serve as a reminder that there are still wild places in this world where humans are not the dominant species, where ancient things still hunt in the shadows between the trees. If you ever find yourself driving through the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest and you need to stop for the night, choose your parking spot carefully. Stay close to other travelers, keep your doors locked, and trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, if the forest gets too quiet, if you catch glimpses of movement in the darkness beyond your headlights, do not ignore those warning signs. Start your engine and drive away. Some encounters are not worth the risk, and some things that live in the deep woods are better left undisturbed. I am going to tell you about something that happened to me last September. Something that still makes me question everything I thought I knew about reality. My name is Matthew, and I have been driving cross-country routes for 22 years. In that time, I have seen just about everything the highway can throw at you. Blizzards, tornadoes, flash floods, and every kind of mechanical breakdown imaginable. But nothing in all those years of experience prepared me for what I encountered on a seemingly ordinary stretch of Interstate 35 through rural Iowa. I was hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Des Moines to Kansas City, a routine run that I had made dozens of times before. The weather was perfect, clear skies and mild temperatures, and I was making good time. I had left Des Moines around 8 p.m., planning to drive straight through the night and arrive in Kansas City by morning. It should have been one of those easy runs that remind you why you love life on the road. Everything was normal until around midnight. I was cruising through the heart of Iowa farmland. Nothing but cornfields stretching endlessly on both sides of the highway. The radio was playing classic rock. My coffee was still hot, and I was settling into that comfortable rhythm that long-haul drivers know so well. That is when I noticed the first sign that something was wrong. I had just passed a road sign that read Osceola, 47 miles, when my GPS started acting strangely. The screen flickered for a moment, then showed a route that made no sense. According to the device, I was somehow driving north instead of south, and my destination had changed to someplace called Nowhere, Iowa, that did not exist on any map. I figured it was just a technical glitch. GPS units malfunction all the time, especially in remote areas where satellite coverage can be spotty. I turned off the device and relied on my own knowledge of the route. After 22 years of driving, I knew Interstate 35 like the back of my hand. I could navigate it blindfolded. But then I passed the same road sign again. Osceola, 47 miles. Exactly the same distance, in exactly the same location. I checked my odometer and confirmed that I had been driving for over an hour since the first time I saw that sign. At 65 miles per hour, I should have covered at least 60 miles, putting me well past Osceola and deep into Missouri. But according to the sign, I had not made any progress at all. I tried to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe there were two identical signs, or maybe I had gotten turned around somehow without realizing it. But as I continued driving south, watching my mirrors and scanning the horizon for familiar landmarks, I began to accept the impossible truth. I was trapped in some kind of loop. Over the next few hours, I passed the same sequence of landmarks repeatedly. The same farmhouse with the red barn and the rusted silo, the same overpass carrying a county road across the interstate, the same billboard advertising a truck stop that, according to the sign, was only 15 miles away, but which I never seemed to reach. And always, every 53 miles exactly, the sign for Osceola promising it was 47 miles ahead. The worst part was the time. My dashboard clock was stuck at 3:17 a.m. No matter how long I drove, no matter how many miles I covered according to my odometer, the clock never advanced. My watch had stopped at the same time, and my cell phone showed no signal and a frozen display. Time itself had become meaningless in this stretch of highway that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of reality. I tried everything I could think of to break free from whatever was happening to me. I took the next exit ramp, only to find myself back on the highway heading south with no memory of how I got there. I pulled over and turned off my engine, thinking maybe I could wait it out, but when I started driving again, I was right back at the beginning of the loop. I even tried turning around and driving north, hoping to escape the trapped section of highway by going in the opposite direction. But after what felt like hours of northbound travel, I found myself approaching the same familiar landmarks from the south, as if the road had somehow twisted back on itself. The fuel gauge was the most disturbing thing of all. Logic said I should have been running out of diesel hours ago, but the needle never moved from the 3/4 tank mark where it had been when the loop began. The engine ran perfectly, consuming fuel that somehow replenished itself, defying every law of physics I understood. As the experience dragged on, I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. Sleep deprivation can cause hallucinations, and I had been driving for hours before the loop started. Maybe I had dozed off behind the wheel and was now trapped in some kind of nightmare brought on by exhaustion and stress. But everything felt too real to be a dream. I could smell the diesel fumes, feel the vibration of the engine through the steering wheel, taste the bitter coffee that never seemed to get cold. If this was a hallucination, it was the most complete and convincing one in medical history. I tried talking to other drivers on the CB radio, but all I got was static. Channel 19, which should have been busy with trucker chatter even in the middle of the night, was completely silent. It was as if I was the only person left in the world, trapped forever on this impossible stretch of highway that led nowhere and everywhere at the same time. The strangest part was how normal everything looked. This was not some hellish landscape or supernatural realm. It was just ordinary Iowa farmland under an ordinary star-filled sky. If not for the repetition and the frozen time, I might never have realized anything was wrong. The mundane nature of the trap made it somehow more terrifying than any obvious supernatural phenomenon would have been. Pure, what should have been dawn, but with the clock still frozen at 3:17 a.m. I had made the loop at least 15 times. I had memorized every detail of the 53-mile circuit, every fence post, every road sign, every slight curve in the asphalt. I knew exactly when to expect each landmark and could predict the view around every bend. That is when I started seeing the other vehicles. They appeared gradually, faintly at first, like mirages shimmering in the distance. Other trucks, cars, motorcycles, all traveling the same endless route. As I focused on them, they became more solid, more real. I could see the drivers, their faces blank and expressionless, staring straight ahead as they completed lap after lap of the same impossible circuit. I tried to signal them, flashing my lights and honking my horn, but they never responded. They seemed unaware of my presence, unaware of their situation, mechanically following the highway in a trance-like state that chilled me to the bone. I began to wonder how long they had been trapped here. Whether some of them had been driving this loop for days, weeks, or even years. The thought that I might join them, that I might eventually lose awareness of my situation and become another mindless ghost driver, filled me with desperate panic. I had to find a way out before that happened, before whatever force was controlling this place claimed my consciousness as well as my physical presence. I started looking for details I had missed before, searching for some clue that might reveal the nature of my prison or provide a key to escape. That is when I noticed the mile markers were wrong. Instead of consecutive numbers marking distance along the interstate, they all showed the same number, 217. Mile marker 217 repeated endlessly, as if this section of highway existed in its own pocket of space-time. As I pondered this discovery, I began to notice that the landscape was not as identical as I had originally thought. There were subtle variations from loop to loop, small changes that suggested the repetition was not perfect. A fence might have one more post, a billboard might be slightly faded, a cloud formation might be different. It was as if I was experiencing multiple versions of the same stretch of highway, variations on a theme rather than exact duplicates. This realization gave me hope. If the loop was not perfect, if there were variations between iterations, then perhaps there was a version where the trap did not exist. I just had to find the right combination of factors that would allow me to break free. I started paying closer attention to these small differences, trying to map the variations and understand their pattern. After several more loops, I thought I detected a rhythm to the changes. The variations seemed to be building towards something, accumulating like static before a thunderstorm. Then, just as the eastern horizon should have been showing the first hints of dawn, everything changed. The frozen clock on my dashboard suddenly jumped to 6:45 a.m. The landscape around me shifted subtly, becoming more vivid and detailed. The other phantom vehicles faded away like smoke, leaving me alone on the highway once again. And there, ahead of me where the Osceola sign should have been, was a different marker entirely. Kansas City, 127 miles. I was free. I drove the remaining distance to Kansas City in a daze, unable to fully process what had happened to me. When I finally arrived at my destination, I discovered that my delivery log showed impossible timestamps. According to my paperwork, I had somehow covered the entire distance from Des Moines to Kansas City in negative time, arriving before I had left. I have never experienced anything like that night again, but I have heard similar stories from other drivers. Tales of highways that lead nowhere, of time behaving strangely on certain routes, of sections of road that seem to exist outside normal reality. Most drivers dismiss these stories as the products of exhaustion and imagination, but I know better now. There are places where the familiar rules do not apply, where the highway becomes something more than just a path between destinations. And if you find yourself driving through one of those places in the deep hours of the night, pay attention to the mile markers. If they stop making sense, if time seems to slow down or stop entirely, if the same landmarks keep appearing no matter how far you drive, do not panic. Keep driving, keep watching, and wait for the pattern to break. Eventually, if you are lucky, the road will remember where it is supposed to lead. I need to share what happened to me during my years driving the northern routes through Montana before I finally had to give up trucking altogether. My name is Joshua, and I spent 12 years hauling freight across the loneliest stretches of highway in America. I always preferred the night shift, loved the solitude and the peace that came with having the road to myself. But there are some kinds of solitude that no human being should ever have to experience, and I learned that lesson the hard way on the remote highways of Big Sky country. It started about 2 years ago on a routine run from Billings to Great Falls. I was carrying a load of construction equipment, heavy steel beams and concrete forms that made my rig handle like a loaded freight train. The weather was clear, temperature in the low 30s, and I was making good time on Highway 87 through the heart of Montana ranch country. Around 1:30 a.m., I switched on my CB radio to channel 19, hoping to catch some trucker chatter or maybe get an update on road conditions ahead. But instead of the usual mix of conversations and static, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice was calling my name. "Joshua," it said, crackling through the speaker with that distinctive CB distortion. "Joshua, can you hear me?" I grabbed the microphone, my hands suddenly shaking. In 12 years of trucking, no one had ever used my real name on the CB. Drivers go by their handles, their company call signs, anything but their actual names. It is an unwritten rule of the road. "Who is this?" I asked. "How do you know my name?" Static filled the channel for a long moment. Then the voice returned. It was different this time, older and more gravelly. "We have been waiting for you, Joshua. We have been waiting a long time." Waiting for what? Who is we? But the voice did not answer directly. Instead, it began describing my route in perfect detail. The mile markers I had just passed, the small towns sleeping in the darkness to my left and right, even the specific load I was carrying. Whoever was talking knew exactly where I was and where I was going. I tried switching to different channels, but the voices followed me. Channel 12, Channel 15, Channel 21, it did not matter. They were always there, always talking about me, always using my name in ways that made my skin crawl. Over the next hour, more voices joined the conversation. They spoke to each other about me as if I was not listening, discussing my route, my cargo, even personal details about my life that no stranger should have known. They talked about my divorce 3 years earlier, about the house I had lost in the settlement, about my ex-wife's new husband who worked at a bank in Missoula. "He is getting close to Lewistown," one voice said. It sounded like an old woman, her words stretched thin by age and static. Should we tell him about the accident? "What accident?" I demanded, keying my microphone. "What are you talking about?" "The one at mile marker 247, another voice replied. This one was younger, maybe a teenager, but there was something wrong with the way it spoke. The words came too slowly, like someone learning to talk for the first time. 3 cars. Very bad. You should slow down, Joshua. I looked at my odometer and realized with growing horror that mile marker 247 was only about 10 miles ahead of me. These voices, whoever they were giving me information about events that had not happened yet. I slowed down anyway, reducing my speed from 65 to 45 as I approached the area they had mentioned. Sure enough, just past mile marker 247, I saw the flashing lights of emergency vehicles scattered across both lanes of the highway. State police, ambulances, a fire truck with its ladder extended. 3 mangled cars were scattered across the median, and I could see paramedics working frantically around what looked like multiple casualties. I pulled over and tried to help, but the state trooper directing traffic waved me on. "Keep moving, driver," he shouted over the noise of the emergency equipment. "We have got this under control." As I drove past the accident scene, the voices on my CB started laughing. Not the normal laughter of human beings, but something hollow and echoing, like sounds bouncing around inside an empty barrel. "Did you see, Joshua?" the old woman's voice asked. "Did you see what we showed you?" "How did you know?" I whispered into the microphone. "How could you possibly know about that accident before it happened?" "We know lots of things," the teenage voice replied. "We know about the truck stop in Great Falls where you always eat breakfast. We know about the waitress there, the one with the red hair who you think is pretty but who you are too shy to talk to. We know about the motel room you keep reserved for Tuesday nights, room 237 at the Roadway Inn." Every detail was correct. I had been eating at the same truck stop in Great Falls for 3 years. And there was indeed a red-haired waitress there who I had developed a crush on, but had never worked up the courage to approach. Room 237 at the Roadway Inn was my regular spot, reserved standing for my weekly runs through the area. "What do you want from me?" I asked. The voices went silent for several minutes, leaving only static and the distant murmur of other channels bleeding through. When they returned, there were more of them than before. I counted at least 7 distinct speakers, ranging from what sounded like a small child to an elderly man with a thick accent I could not identify. They began telling me stories. Stories about other truckers who had driven these same routes, drivers who had disappeared without explanation or been found dead in their cabs with no apparent cause. They spoke about accidents that had been arranged, about mechanical failures that had been orchestrated, about drivers who had been driven insane by voices on their CB radios. "We collect them," the child's voice explained with innocent enthusiasm. "The lonely ones, the ones who drive at night when nobody else is around. They come to live with us in the space between the channels. That is where we are now," the old man added. "In the static between frequencies, in the empty places where radio waves go to die. It is not so bad here, Joshua. There is no traffic, no deadlines, no dispatchers yelling at you about delivery times. Just the open road forever and always." I tried to turn off the radio, but it would not shut off. The voices continued even when I unplugged it from the power source, even when I removed the fuses from the electrical panel. They were not coming through the radio anymore, they were coming from inside my own head. As I continued driving toward Great Falls, the voices became more personal, more invasive. They began discussing my thoughts as I had them, commenting on my fears and reactions in real time. When I wondered if I was losing my mind, they laughed and assured me that sanity was overrated. When I considered pulling over and calling for help, they reminded me that my cell phone had no signal in this remote area. "There is nowhere to run, Joshua," the old woman said gently. "We are inside you now. We know everything you know, Feel everything you feel. You belong to us. By the time I reached Great Falls, I was barely holding on to my sanity. The voices had been talking continuously for over 6 hours, describing every mile of road, every passing car, every thought that crossed my mind. They knew my social security number, my bank account balance, the name of my first dog, the recurring nightmare I had been having since childhood. I completed my delivery in a daze, unloaded my cargo with shaking hands, and checked into my usual room at the Roadway Inn. But the voices followed me there, commenting on the faded wallpaper, the broken air conditioning unit, the way I always slept on the left side of the bed. Over the next several weeks, the situation only got worse. The voices were with me constantly now, not just while I was driving, but every moment of every day. They critiqued my choice of breakfast cereal, discussed the quality of truck stop coffee, offered unwanted advice about my driving technique. Sleep became impossible because they would whisper continuously in my ears, telling stories about other drivers they had collected over the years. I tried everything I could think of to get rid of them. I saw doctors who prescribed medication for schizophrenia. I visited a priest who attempted an exorcism. I even consulted a psychiatrist who specialized in stress-related disorders in professional drivers. Nothing helped. The voices remained, as constant and inescapable as my own heartbeat. The final straw came 3 months later on another night run through Montana. I was hauling automotive parts from Bozeman to Helena when the voices began giving me directions that differed from my planned route. They insisted I take a series of back roads through the wilderness, promising they would show me something special if I followed their guidance. Against my better judgment, I obeyed. The alternative routes led me deeper into the mountains along increasingly narrow and treacherous roads that barely accommodated my large rig. Hours passed as I climbed switchbacks and navigated hairpin turns, following directions from voices that laughed and whispered encouragement with every mile. Finally, they directed me to stop at an overlook beside a deep canyon. As I set my air brakes, they explained what they wanted to show me. "Look down there, Joshua," the child's voice said excitedly. "Look at all the trucks." I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the edge of the overlook, then shined the beam down into the canyon below. What I saw made my knees buckle with terror. Hundreds of semi-trucks were scattered across the canyon floor, rusted and twisted wrecks that looked like they had been there for years or even decades. Some were partially buried by rock slides, others were burned out shells, but all of them showed the unmistakable signs of having driven straight off the cliff above. "These are our friends," the old woman's voice explained, "drivers who decided to join us permanently. It is very peaceful down there, Joshua. No more schedules, no more traffic, no more loneliness, just eternal rest in the company of fellow travelers." That was when I understood what the voices wanted from me. They were not just tormenting me for entertainment, they were recruiting me. Gradually wearing down my resistance until I would be willing to drive my truck off a cliff just to make them stop talking. I ran back to my rig, started the engine, and drove away from that overlook as fast as the winding mountain roads would allow. The voices screamed at me for hours, angry that I had rejected their invitation, but I kept driving until I reached the main highway again. The next morning, I turned in my resignation to the trucking company and walked away from the profession that had been my life for 12 years. The voices still talk to me sometimes, usually late at night when the world is quiet and I am alone with my thoughts. But they have less power over me now that I am not isolated on remote highways. Less ability to manipulate my reality when I am surrounded by other people and normal human conversation. I work at a warehouse now, loading and unloading trucks for other drivers. It is honest work, and it keeps me grounded in the normal world where voices come from human beings instead of empty frequencies in the radio spectrum. Sometimes I see the fear in a driver's eyes when they talk about the long-haul routes through Montana, and I want to warn them about what waits out there in the darkness between radio stations. But I know they would not believe me, just like I would not have believed anyone who had tried to warn me. So I keep my story to myself, and I count myself lucky to have escaped the fate of those drivers whose trucks rest forever in that hidden canyon. But on quiet nights when the wind is blowing just right, I can still hear them calling my name from somewhere far away, promising me that the road is waiting whenever I am ready to return. I need to tell someone about what happened to me at a truck stop in Arizona last year. It is something that still gives me nightmares, and I hope sharing it might help other female drivers stay safe out there. My name is Brittany, and I have been driving professionally for 7 years. Being a woman in this industry means you learn to be extra careful, extra aware, and extra prepared for situations that male drivers might never have to face. I was hauling a load of textiles from Los Angeles to Phoenix, a routine run that I had made dozens of times before. It was early November and the desert nights were getting cold, so I was looking forward to a hot meal and maybe a shower before getting my mandatory rest. I pulled into a large truck stop just outside Flagstaff around 9:30 p.m., one of those 24-hour places with a restaurant, convenience store, and full-service facilities. The parking lot was about half full, which was normal for that time of night. I found a spot near the back where I could park my rig without blocking anyone, but close enough to the main building that I would feel safe walking back and forth. As a woman driver, you learn to think about these things: lighting, visibility, escape routes. They become second nature after a while. I went through my usual routine, secured my load, did a quick inspection of my equipment, then headed inside to grab dinner and use the facilities. The truck stop was busy but not crowded, filled with the usual mix of drivers, travelers, and local workers stopping by for coffee and snacks. I noticed him while I was ordering food at the restaurant counter. He was sitting alone in a booth near the window, a thin man in his 40s with greasy hair and clothes that looked like they had not been washed in weeks. What caught my attention was not his appearance, but the way he was watching me. His eyes followed my every movement as I ordered my meal, paid at the register, and found a table on the opposite side of the dining area. I tried to ignore him, focusing on my food and the trucking magazine I had brought in with me. But every time I looked up, he was still staring. Not the casual glance you might give to another person in a restaurant, but an intense, predatory stare that made my skin crawl. When I finished eating and got up to leave, he got up too. When I stopped at the convenience store to buy coffee for the road, he lingered nearby, pretending to browse the magazine rack while keeping me in his peripheral vision. When I walked back out to the parking lot, he followed at a distance. My truck was parked in a row with several others, and as I approached it, I could see him reflected in the side mirrors, hanging back about 50 yards, but definitely following me. Every instinct I had developed over 7 years of solo driving was screaming warnings. I climbed into my cab and immediately locked the doors, then sat there for a few minutes watching him in my mirrors. He had stopped next to a pickup truck several spaces away and was making a show of checking his tires, but his attention was clearly still focused on me. I considered driving away immediately, finding another place to take my rest break, but federal regulations required me to log 8 hours of off-duty time before I could legally drive again. I was already pushing close to my maximum allowable hours, and I could not afford to get pulled over for a logbook violation. Instead, I decided to wait him out. Surely he would get tired of whatever game he was playing and move on to bother someone else, or better yet, just leave entirely. I settled into my sleeper berth with a book and tried to relax, checking my mirrors periodically to see if he was still out there. He was. For over an hour, he stayed near that pickup truck, sometimes sitting on the tailgate, sometimes walking around the vehicle, but always positioned where he could keep an eye on my truck. Other drivers came and went around us, but he seemed oblivious to everything except me. Around 11:30 p.m., I finally saw him walk back toward the main building, and I allowed myself to relax a little. Maybe he had given up. Maybe he was just some harmless weirdo who got his kicks from making women uncomfortable. I closed my curtains, turned off my interior lights, and tried to get some sleep. I was awakened around 2:15 a.m. by the sound of footsteps on gravel, slow and deliberate, circling my truck. I lay perfectly still in my bunk, listening as the footsteps moved from the front of my rig to the driver's side, then around to the back of the trailer, then up the passenger side. Whoever was out there was taking their time, studying my truck, looking for weaknesses. The footsteps stopped near my passenger door, and I could hear the soft sound of someone breathing heavily just outside. Then came the gentle rattle of a door handle being tested. My passenger door was locked, but the sound of someone trying to open it made my blood turn to ice. I reached for my cell phone to call 911, but realized I had no signal. The truck stop was in one of those dead zones where cellular coverage was spotty at best. I was on my own. The person outside moved to my driver's door and tested that handle as well. When it did not open, I heard what sounded like metal tools being scraped against the lock mechanism. He was trying to break into my truck. I grabbed the tire iron I kept under my bunk and crept forward to the cab, staying low and trying not to make any noise that would alert him to the fact that I was awake. Through a gap in my curtains, I could see a figure hunched beside my driver's door, working on the lock with what looked like a set of lockpicks. That is when I realized this was not some random opportunist. This was someone who had come prepared, someone who had done this before. The way he moved, the tools he carried, the patience he showed, everything about his behavior suggested experience and planning. I was trapped. If I tried to start my truck and drive away, he would hear the engine and might panic, possibly becoming violent. If I stayed where I was, he might succeed in getting the door open, and I would be cornered in my sleeper berth with nowhere to run. I decided to take the offensive. I moved to my driver's seat as quietly as possible, then suddenly flipped on all my exterior lights and laid on the horn. The blast of sound shattered the night silence, and I saw the figure outside stumble backward in surprise. "Get away from my truck!" I screamed through the closed window. "I am calling the police." The man looked up at me, and in the harsh glare of my headlights, I could see his face clearly for the first time. His eyes were wild and unfocused, his expression a mixture of rage and frustration. He was not just some harmless creep. This was someone dangerous, someone who had been planning to do serious harm. Instead of running away, he moved toward my driver's door again, this time producing what looked like a crowbar. He was going to try to force his way in. I kept the horn blaring while I reached for my CB radio, broadcasting on channel 19 for any driver who might be listening. "Mayday, mayday, this is a female driver under attack at the Flagstaff truck stop. I need immediate assistance. Repeat, I need help now." The response was immediate. Several drivers came back over the radio, and I could see lights coming on in other trucks around the parking lot. Within minutes, at least 4 other truckers were walking toward my location, some carrying flashlights and tire irons of their own. The man with the crowbar saw them coming and finally decided to retreat. He ran toward the pickup truck he had been lurking near earlier, but instead of getting in it, he disappeared into the darkness beyond the parking lot lights. One of the drivers who had come to help tried to follow him, but he had vanished into the desert scrub. The state police arrived about 20 minutes later, followed by the local sheriff's department. They took my statement and examined my truck for evidence of the attempted break-in, finding scratches around both door locks that confirmed someone had indeed tried to pick them. The detective who handled the case told me that I was lucky to have fought back when I did. Over the past 18 months, there had been at least 6 similar incidents at truck stops throughout Arizona and New Mexico, all targeting female drivers who were resting alone. In 3 of those cases, the attacker had succeeded in gaining entry to the cab, and the outcomes had been tragic. They never caught the man who attacked me that night. The pickup truck he had been using turned out to be stolen, abandoned in a parking lot in Flagstaff the next morning. Security cameras at the truck stop had malfunctioned conveniently, providing no useful footage of the incident. I completed my run to Phoenix the next day, but I have never felt the same level of security while taking my rest breaks. I installed additional locks on my doors, carry multiple communication devices in case my cell phone fails, and always park as close to the main building as possible. I also invested in a personal alarm system that connects directly to emergency services. The experience taught me that the dangers female drivers face on the road go beyond mechanical breakdowns and bad weather. There are predators out there who specifically target women in the trucking industry, taking advantage of our isolation and the remote locations where we are required to rest. I have shared my story with other female drivers whenever possible, hoping to help them stay alert and prepared. We look out for each other in this industry, sharing information about safe parking spots and dangerous locations, but it should not be our responsibility alone to stay safe. Truck stops need better security, better lighting, and better surveillance systems. Law enforcement needs to take these attacks seriously and coordinate their efforts across state lines. And trucking companies need to provide their female drivers with the resources and training necessary to protect themselves. Until those changes happen, we have to rely on our own awareness and preparation. Trust your instincts if something feels wrong. Do not hesitate to call for help or make noise if you feel threatened. And remember that your safety is more important than any delivery schedule or company policy. I still drive solo routes, and I still love the freedom and independence that comes with life on the road. But I am more careful now, more aware of the risks that come with being a woman alone in remote places. The predators are out there waiting for opportunities, and the only way to stay safe is to make sure they never get the chance to strike. What I am about to tell you happened to me 6 months ago on what should have been a routine regional run through rural Kentucky. I need to share this because I still do not understand what occurred that night, and I hope maybe someone else has experienced something similar. My name is Samantha, and I have been driving the same routes through Kentucky and Tennessee for 4 years. I know these roads like I know my own reflection, every curve and hill, every truck stop and way station. But on this particular night, the familiar became alien, and I found myself trapped in a version of reality that still haunts my dreams. I was hauling auto parts from Louisville to Nashville, a route I had driven at least 50 times before. It was a clear October evening, temperature in the low 60s, perfect driving weather. I left Louisville around 7 p.m., planning to make the delivery by midnight and then catch some sleep before heading back north the next morning. Everything was normal for the first hour. I cruised south on Interstate 65, listening to country music and watching the sunset paint the Kentucky countryside in shades of gold and amber. I passed all the familiar landmarks: the Jim Beam Distillery, the exit for Bardstown, the rolling hills dotted with horse farms that made this part of the state famous. But somewhere around the 8:30 mark, things started to feel different. The first sign that something was wrong came when I passed a billboard that I had never seen before. It was advertising a restaurant called the Crossroads Diner and claimed it was the next exit just 2 miles ahead. I had driven this stretch of highway dozens of times, and there was no restaurant at that exit, just a small gas station and a few houses scattered through the woods. I figured it was a new business, something that had opened since my last run through the area. But as I approached the exit, I could see that the landscape around it had changed too. The gas station was gone, replaced by a cluster of buildings that looked older, more weathered, as if they had been there for decades instead of being newly constructed. I decided to take the exit and check out this mysterious diner, curious about how I could have missed such a significant change to my regular route. But when I turned off the interstate, the exit ramp led to a road I did not recognize. Instead of the narrow county road that should have been there, I found myself on a 4-lane highway that stretched into the distance through terrain that looked subtly wrong. The hills were the right shape, and the trees were the right species, but everything seemed slightly more vivid, more detailed than it should have been. It was like looking at a high-definition version of reality, too sharp and clear to be entirely natural. The Crossroads Diner turned out to be a classic 1950s-style establishment, complete with neon signs and chrome fixtures that gleamed under parking lot lights. The parking lot was full of vehicles, but they were all cars and pickup trucks from decades past. Classic Chevrolets and Fords from the 60s and 70s, all in perfect condition as if they had just rolled off the showroom floor. I parked my rig and walked inside, hoping to find someone who could explain what was happening. The diner was packed with customers, all dressed in clothing styles that seemed to belong to previous eras. Men in work clothes and fedoras, women in dresses and hairdos that I had only seen in old photographs. They all looked up when I entered, and their faces showed polite curiosity but no recognition that anything about my appearance was unusual or out of place. I ordered coffee from a waitress who could have stepped out of a Norman Rockwell painting, then asked her about the interstate construction that must have happened recently. She looked at me with genuine confusion. "Interstate?" she said. "Honey, there is not any interstate around here, just the old state highway that runs north to Louisville and south to Nashville. Has been that way for as long as I can remember." I tried to explain that I had just driven off Interstate 65, but she insisted there was no such road. Other customers joined the conversation, all of them agreeing that the main highway through the area was State Route 31. A 2-lane road that had been the primary north-south corridor for decades. Feeling increasingly disoriented, I paid for my coffee and walked back outside. My truck was still there in the parking lot, looking massive and modern next to the vintage automobiles surrounding it. But when I climbed into the cab and tried to navigate back to the interstate, I discovered that my GPS was showing locations that did not make sense. According to the device, I was in a town called Millerville, Kentucky, population 2,847. But there was no such town on any map I had ever seen. The GPS was showing roads and highways that differed completely from what I knew to be the actual layout of the area. I decided to ignore the GPS and navigate by memory, driving what I thought should be the route back to Interstate 65. But after 20 minutes of driving through countryside that looked familiar yet subtly different, I found myself on a 2-lane highway marked as Route 31, heading south toward Nashville. This was impossible. Route 31 was a historical designation that had been replaced by the interstate system decades ago. Yet here I was, driving on a road that officially no longer existed through a landscape that seemed to be a mixture of the Kentucky I knew and some alternate version that had developed along different lines. Other vehicles on Route 31 were a mixture of vintage cars and more modern vehicles like mine. The drivers I could see looked normal enough, but there was something in their expressions, a kind of resigned acceptance that suggested they were as confused as I was, but had given up trying to understand their situation. I tried my CB radio, hoping to contact other truck drivers who might explain what was happening. Channel 19 was active, but the conversations I heard were strange. Drivers were discussing routes and destinations that did not exist, talking about companies I had never heard of, referencing trucking regulations that bore no resemblance to current federal requirements. "Breaker 19, this is Moondog eastbound on Route 31, one voice said. "Anyone know if the scales are running at the Millerville checkpoint?" "That is a negative, Moondog," another voice replied. "Haven't seen a scale house on this route in 15 years. You might be thinking of the old Interstate 65 corridor, but that got shut down after the big accident back in '73. I keyed my microphone, hoping to get clarification. "This is a southbound driver looking for Interstate 65, I said. "Can anyone give me directions to get back to the main highway?" The channel went silent for a long moment. Then the first voice came back. "Driver, there is no Interstate 65 in this area. Route 31 is the main north-south highway through central Kentucky. Has been since they built it back in 1926. You feeling okay out there?" I was not feeling okay. I was beginning to suspect that I had somehow driven into a version of Kentucky where the interstate highway system had never been built, where the old federal highways still carried the bulk of long-distance traffic, where small towns like Millerville had continued to thrive instead of being bypassed and forgotten. For the next 3 hours, I drove south on Route 31 through this alternate Kentucky, passing through towns that should not have existed and seeing landmarks that had been demolished or replaced decades ago in my version of reality. Everything was slightly different, slightly wrong, as if I was looking at the world through a distorted mirror. The worst part was the growing realization that other people around me seemed to accept this reality as normal. The drivers I spoke to on the CB, the customers at gas stations where I stopped for directions, even the state police officers I saw patrolling the highway, all acted as if this version of Kentucky was the only one that had ever existed. Around 2 a.m., I finally saw signs for Nashville ahead. But when I reached the city limits, I discovered that this was not the Nashville I knew. The skyline was different, dominated by buildings that looked like they belonged to the 1960s rather than the 21st century. The interstate loop around the city was absent, replaced by a network of state highways that wound through neighborhoods I did not recognize. I managed to find my delivery destination, but the warehouse was in a location that should have been occupied by a shopping center in my version of reality. The receiving clerk seemed surprised to see me, claiming they had not been expecting a delivery until the following week. But he accepted my load anyway, and I got my paperwork signed without any major complications. By dawn, I was exhausted and confused, desperate to find my way back to the reality I knew. I started driving north on what the local signs insisted was Route 31, retracing my path from the night before. But somewhere around sunrise, as I was passing through an area that looked like it should have been near Bardstown, the landscape began to shift again. Gradually, the vintage buildings and classic cars gave way to the modern Kentucky I recognized. Route 31 became Interstate 65. The small towns resumed their familiar names, and my GPS began showing locations that matched my memory of the area. By the time I reached Louisville, everything was back to normal. The Crossroads Diner was gone, replaced by the small gas station I remembered. The exit looked exactly as it should have, and there was no sign that the events of the previous night had ever occurred. I completed my return trip without incident, but I have never been able to explain what happened during those 8 hours in alternate Kentucky. I have researched the history of the area, looking for references to towns like Millerville or restaurants like the Crossroads Diner, but I have found nothing that matches my experience. Other drivers I have spoken to have shared similar stories, tales of roads that lead to places that should not exist, of getting lost in familiar territory and finding themselves in versions of reality where history unfolded differently. Most of them dismiss these experiences as the products of fatigue and stress, but I know what I saw and experienced that night. I still drive the Louisville to Nashville route regularly, but I have never encountered that alternate version of Kentucky again. Sometimes late at night when I am driving through the more remote stretches of highway, I wonder if those roads are still there, existing parallel to the ones we know, accessible only under certain circumstances that I do not understand. The experience has made me more aware of the strangeness that can lurk beneath the surface of familiar places. There are layers to reality that most of us never see, alternate versions of the world that exist alongside the one we think we know. For truck drivers who spend their lives traveling between distant places, the boundaries between these realities may be thinner, easier to cross when conditions are right. I have learned to pay closer attention to the small details during my runs, watching for signs that the world around me is beginning to shift into something different. Because if it happened once, it could happen again, and next time I want to be prepared for the journey into the spaces between what is real and what should be impossible. I have to tell someone about what has been happening to me for the past 8 months. Every time I think about quitting trucking altogether, something tells me I need to share this story. Maybe to warn other drivers, or maybe just to convince myself that I am not losing my mind. My name is Taylor, and I have been driving solo runs across the desert Southwest for 6 years. I always preferred the night shift, loved the solitude and the way the highway looks under starlight. But now the darkness holds something I never wanted to find, and I am not sure I can ever escape it. It started last January on a routine run from Phoenix to Albuquerque. I was hauling electronics, expensive stuff that required careful handling and tight security. The weather was perfect, clear and cold, with temperatures in the low 40s and unlimited visibility. I had left Phoenix around 10 p.m., planning to drive straight through and arrive in Albuquerque by dawn. Everything was normal for the first few hours. I cruised east on Interstate 40, listening to late-night talk radio and watching the desert landscape roll past under my headlights. The highway was mostly empty except for the occasional car or long-haul trucker heading in the opposite direction. Around 1:30 a.m., somewhere between Flagstaff and Winslow, I first noticed the figure in my mirrors. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe the reflection of my own interior lighting or a shadow cast by my load straps. But as I watched more carefully, I began to see that there was something distinctly human-shaped moving in the darkness behind my trailer. It appeared to be a tall, thin person dressed in dark clothing, walking at a steady pace that somehow kept exact time with my truck's speed. Even though I was traveling at 70 miles per hour, the figure maintained its position about 50 yards behind my trailer. Never falling back, never catching up, just maintaining that precise distance like it was tethered to my rig by an invisible rope. I slowed down to 60, then 55, thinking maybe I would lose whatever optical illusion was creating this effect. But the figure slowed down with me, maintaining that exact same distance. When I sped back up to 75, it matched my speed perfectly, never breaking stride, never showing any sign of effort despite the impossible pace. I tried changing lanes, thinking maybe it was some kind of reflection from a vehicle in the opposite direction. But the figure followed me across the highway, still walking steadily behind my trailer as if the lane change had never occurred. I grabbed my CB radio and called out to any drivers who might be in the area. Breaker 19, this is an eastbound driver on I-40 near Winslow. Anyone else seeing anything strange out here tonight? The response came back immediately. Negative, eastbound. Highway looks clear from here. You feeling okay out there? I wanted to describe what I was seeing, but I knew how crazy it would sound. Oh, person walking behind my truck at highway speeds, following me across lane changes, matching my speed no matter how fast or slow I drove. No one would believe it, and I was beginning to wonder if I should believe it myself. For the next hour, the figure continued its impossible pursuit. I watched it in my mirrors, trying to make out details, but it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. No matter how I adjusted my mirrors or turned on additional lights, I could never see its face or any specific features. It was just a dark shape in the rough outline of a person, walking with mechanical precision through the desert night. Around 3 a.m., I pulled into a truck stop near Winona, hoping to break whatever spell was holding this apparition to my truck. I parked under the brightest lights I could find and immediately jumped out to check behind my trailer. Nothing. The pavement was empty, showing no sign that anyone had been walking there. But as I climbed back into my cab and checked my mirrors, the figure was there again, standing motionless about 50 yards behind my truck, waiting. I tried to ignore it, went inside the truck stop, bought coffee, used the restroom, called my dispatcher to check in. But when I came back outside 20 minutes later, it was still there in exactly the same position, as if it had never moved. I completed the rest of my run to Albuquerque with the figure following behind me every mile. When I finally reached my destination and backed up to the loading dock, I watched in my mirrors as it simply faded away like smoke, vanishing into the dawn light. I hoped that would be the end of it, that whatever I had encountered was tied to that specific route or that particular night. But I was wrong. Over the following weeks, the figure began appearing on other runs, other highways, always in my mirrors, always maintaining that exact distance behind my trailer. It did not matter where I was driving or what time of day it was. Desert highways, mountain passes, city streets, the figure was always there. During daylight runs, it appeared as a heat mirage, shimmering in the distance but clearly maintaining the shape of a walking person. At night, it was a solid shadow moving through darkness with inhuman persistence. The worst part was how it began to affect my driving. I found myself constantly checking my mirrors, so obsessed with watching the figure that I started missing turns, running red lights, even rear-ending another vehicle at a stop sign, because I was staring at my mirrors instead of watching the road ahead. Other drivers started commenting on my erratic behavior. My dispatcher received complaints about my sudden lane changes, my inconsistent speeds, my failure to respond to radio calls because I was too focused on whatever was behind me. I tried switching to day runs, thinking maybe the figure would be less visible in sunlight, but it adapted, becoming more translucent but still clearly present, still walking, with that same mechanical stride that matched my speed exactly. I tried taking vacation time, staying home for 2 weeks, hoping to break whatever connection had formed between me and this impossible follower. But the first time I got back in a truck, there it was again, waiting patiently behind my trailer as if it had never left. That was when it started getting into my cab. I first noticed it during a night run through New Mexico in late March. I was checking my mirrors as usual when I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. When I turned to look, there was nothing there, but I could swear I had seen a dark shape seated in my passenger seat for just a split second. Over the following weeks, these sightings became more frequent and more distinct. The figure would appear in my passenger seat, always facing forward, never moving or speaking, just sitting there with that same light-absorbing darkness that made it impossible to see any details. At first, it would only appear for a few seconds before fading away, but gradually the visitations lasted longer. Minutes at a time, then entire hours where I would be driving with this impossible passenger sitting silently beside me. I tried talking to it, asking what it wanted, why it was following me, but it never responded, never acknowledged my presence, never gave any indication that it was aware of my existence. It just sat there, A hole in reality shaped like a person accompanying me on my endless journeys across the American Southwest. The real terror began when it started reaching for the steering wheel. The first time it happened, I thought I was hallucinating from exhaustion. I was driving through the Arizona desert around 2 a.m. when I saw in my peripheral vision a dark hand extending toward my steering wheel. When I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there. But I could feel a cold presence beside me, could sense something that wanted to take control of my truck. Over the following weeks, these attempts became more frequent and more aggressive. The figure would reach for my steering wheel, my gear shift, my brake pedal, trying to influence my driving in ways that would have been catastrophic if it had succeeded. I started wearing gloves and long sleeves, thinking maybe physical barriers would help, but the cold touch of its presence could penetrate any material. When it reached for the controls, I could feel ice-cold fingers brushing against my hands, could sense an alien intelligence trying to override my own will. The worst incident happened 2 months ago on a night run between Tucson and El Paso. I was driving through a particularly remote stretch of desert when the figure appeared in my passenger seat and immediately began reaching for the steering wheel. This time, instead of just brushing against my hands, it seemed to partially merge with my own movements, creating a horrible sensation of shared control. For several terrifying minutes, I was not entirely in command of my own truck. The steering wheel would turn slightly without my input. The speed would increase or decrease according to some alien will that was not my own. I fought against this influence with every ounce of strength I possessed, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white, forcing my foot to maintain pressure on the accelerator despite the creature's attempts to make me brake or accelerate. Finally, I managed to pull over at a rest area and stop the truck. The moment I set the air brakes, the figure vanished, leaving me alone and shaking in my cab. That was when I realized that this thing, whatever it was, did not just want to follow me. It wanted to possess me, to take control of my truck and use it for purposes I could not comprehend. I have been trying to find ways to get rid of it ever since. I have consulted priests, paranormal investigators, even a Native American shaman who specializes in desert spirits. Some of them claim to sense the presence when I describe it, but none of them have been able to remove it or explain what it wants. The shaman told me that certain places in the desert are thin spots where the boundary between our world and others becomes permeable. He suggested that I might have picked up this follower by driving through one of these areas during a time when conditions were right for such contact. But knowing what caused it does not help me get rid of it. The figure is still there, still following behind my truck on every run, still appearing in my passenger seat when conditions are right. And I can feel it getting stronger, more solid, more capable of influencing the physical world. I am afraid that soon it will be able to take complete control, to use my truck as a weapon or to drive it to some destination that exists in its reality rather than mine. When that happens, I do not think I will be coming back. I have started carrying a small video camera in my cab, trying to document these encounters, but the figure never appears on film. It exists only in mirrors and peripheral vision, in the spaces between what is real and what should be impossible. If you are a driver reading this, be careful about the routes you choose, especially through remote desert areas where the landscape has remained unchanged for thousands of years. There are things out there that are older than our highways, older than our civilization, and some of them are still hungry for contact with the modern world. Pay attention to your mirrors, but not too much attention. If you start seeing things that should not be there, do not try to investigate or understand them. Just keep driving, stay focused on the road ahead, and hope that whatever is following you eventually loses interest and moves on to someone else. Because once it attaches itself to you, once it decides that you belong to it, there may be no way to break free. And in the end, you might find yourself becoming a passenger in your own life, watching helplessly as something else takes control of the wheel.